Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip quietly into the shadows of temples that don't make it into history class. You're about to step barefoot into candlelit chambers where incense coils in the air, walls murmur secrets, and rituals blur the lines between devotion and desire. This isn't your average archaeological tour, because what we're exploring tonight was hidden on purpose, and yeah, you probably won't survive this, at least not the version of you that thinks ancient people were all solemn priests and dusty scrolls. Nope. They had their own ways of touching the divine, sometimes literally, and pleasure, in many temples, was the bridge to the sacred. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also tell me your city and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing where and when we're travelling together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a room carved from smooth stone low lit by flickering flames in bronze bowls. The walls pulse with carved patterns, serpents spiralling around goddesses with almond eyes and wide hips. The scent of sandalwood fills your lungs. A whisper drifts past your ear, but there's no one behind you. This is the beginning of a journey that doesn't unfold in straight lines. Instead, it spirals, circles, curves like the hips of the statues lining the walls. Welcome to the sanctum where history meets heat. You find yourself in a place that doesn't quite exist anymore. Somewhere between Babylon and your bedroom. A hazy realm pieced together from ruins, papyrus scraps, scandalized ancient texts and archaeological theories delivered in low voices over wine. The kind of history that smells faintly of danger. The kind that rarely survives conquest, fire, or doctrine. We're not talking about casual indulgences here. This is ritual, sacred, codified and complex. In many early civilizations, the body wasn't the enemy of the spirit, it was the gateway. Temples weren't just for sacrifice and supplication, they were designed, in some places, as portals, bridging flesh and God, and pleasure in all its intimate forms wasn't a distraction from the divine. It was the ritual, the offering, the key. You feel it now, the room humming, not with electricity but with the weight of old intentions. The walls have heard things, maybe they still echo. And you're starting to realize something. To understand these forgotten rites, you can't stand outside notebook in hand. You have to step in. You have to imagine the heat, the bodies, the incense, the chanting, the utter absence of shame, or rather, the presence of something else, reverence. In front of you stands a figure draped in gauze-thin linen, face serene, hands outstretched. You know she's not real, at least not now, but in her eyes is that look people get when they're more than just people. She is priestess, oracle, midwife to the mystery. She moves without stunned sound, but her steps are rhythmic, like she's walking in time with something ancient and pulsing beneath the floor. You're not sure if you're meant to bow or follow, but either way you're being initiated, silently, sensually, deeply. Here's your first fact to tuck into your pillow tonight. The earliest known temples, those of Inanna in Sumer, around 3000 BCE, were sites not only of celestial reverence but of embodied ritual. It wasn't uncommon for priestesses to serve as conduits for the goddess herself, engaging in sacred sexual rites that were part of annual fertility festivals. These weren't acts of hedonism, they were cosmic maintenance. The goddess's pleasure was believed to ensure abundance for the city. Crops, rain, life itself, delivered through ecstasy. Suddenly, the division between sacred and sensual starts to blur. It's not about sin, it's about synthesis. Now here's something strange. In some Mesopotamian hymns, the goddess is described in nearly pornographic detail, but always with awe, not shame. One text sings of her thighs of lapis lazuli and her honey-sweet mouth. The tone is worship, not lust. Some modern scholars still don't know what to do with this. Was it symbolic language, embellished metaphor? Or were these rituals genuinely enacted as written? The debate is ongoing, with translations ranging from the poetic to the explicit, and interpretation shifting based on the scholar's courage or funding. And speaking of debates, let's chew on this. Was sacred sex in these temples empowering or exploitative? On one side, you've got theories suggesting priestesses held immense power, commanding respect and playing central roles in spiritual life. On the other, there's the darker suggestion that temple rituals may have served economic or political agendas, sometimes blurring dangerously with institutionalized prostitution. But maybe it's not either or. Maybe the truth, as always, is tangled, like silk sheets on a stone floor. You shift your weight, the floor's warm. Not metaphorically, it's actually warm, like someone left the heat on under the stone. A breeze brushes your cheek, though there are no windows. It smells of myrrh and something faintly sweet, jasmine or desire. A drumbeat starts somewhere distant, slow and deep like a heartbeat. Or footsteps. You're not alone here, and that's part of the point. In these temples, pleasure wasn't private. It was communal, witnessed, shared, not in the way that makes modern people squirm, but in a way that reframed vulnerability as strength, union as transcendence. No shame, just presence, purpose, power. Now, take a deep breath. You've only just crossed the threshold. You haven't even reached the cities with carved Kama Sutras, or the wine-soaked rites of Dionysus, or the whispered prayers that accompany a lover's climax in the name of a goddess. Those are still ahead. But tonight you're no longer a tourist. You're part of the ritual, not to reenact, but to remember. And maybe, just maybe, to wake something ancient within you that recognizes this strange truth. The divine doesn't always speak in thunder. Sometimes it moans. You don't get much time to adjust before the scene shifts. The warm stone beneath your feet softens, blurs, and when it clears again, you're standing in the middle of an ancient city that smells like dust, honeyed wine, and something faintly metallic. Blood, maybe, or bronze. The sun above you isn't just hot, it's mythic. It stares down like it knows your secrets. This is Uruk, one of the earliest cities in the world, and if your geography is rusty, we're deep in ancient Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq. Towering ziggurats rise like staircases for the gods, and nestled between them, behind thick walls, sits a place more intimate than a palace, the Temple of Inanna. At first glance, it's a little underwhelming. Mud brick, modest, but the energy here is unmistakable, coiled and potent like a snake sunning itself on sacred ground. You slip inside the temple's shadow and the air changes. Cooler, sure, but heavier. The smell of burned offerings, figs, resin, oil lingers in the air. Soft music filters through the stone corridors. Reed pipes, finger cymbals, a woman's voice singing something wordless but familiar in your gut. A priestess brushes past you, wrapped in sheer linen, gold cuffs on her wrists, and dark kohl ringing her eyes. Her body is an instrument, practiced and precise. Every motion is deliberate. She's not performing for you, she's embodying something, living mythology. And you, lucky intruder, are just barely being tolerated. This isn't a museum. It's a temple in full ritual swing. And tonight is no ordinary night. It's the festival of the sacred marriage, where Inanna, goddess of love, war and fertility, weds Dumuzi, the shepherd king. But don't expect wedding cake and slow dances. This is not that kind of celebration. A high priestess, representing Inanna, will enact the divine union with a king or chosen consort. Their union, sensual, ritualized, publicly honored, is said to secure the land's fertility for the year. Crops will grow, rivers will swell, wombs will fill. The people depend on this ecstasy. And whether the ritual is symbolic or very, very literal, that depends on who you ask. One account, carved into a clay tablet and translated by some rather red-faced archaeologists, describes the goddess's lap that is sweet, her lover's erect cedar, and how she takes him into her holy vulva. Yeah, it's not exactly PG. And this text isn't scandalous because it's sexual, it's sacred. The pleasure described isn't shameful, it's essential. Divine love made manifest through human bodies. You're watching the first known instance of ritualized sacred sex as a cosmic act, and it is, somehow, both erotic and reverent. You wonder how the people standing outside the temple walls, ordinary citizens of Uruk, feel about all this. Are they embarrassed? Curious? Celebratory? Turns out they'd gather, sing songs, even recite erotic poetry. Young women might wear elaborate jewelry to imitate Inanna, hoping to channel her power. Young men might offer libations, hoping for a night of passion or a good harvest, or both. And when the high priestess emerges the next morning glowing and gilded, she isn't just someone who's participated in an intimate rite. She's now temporarily the goddess herself. But here's where it gets messy. Modern scholars can't agree on what exactly took place behind those temple walls. Was it truly a physical act between priestess and king? Or was it symbolic, ritualized poetry, gestures, possibly even a dream journey or trance? Some argue that sacred marriage was a ceremonial narrative, not a literal performance. Others? They point to dozens of similar festivals across Mesopotamia where temple priestesses were directly involved in sexual rites. One theory even suggests that the act was performed on an elevated platform for public viewing, not in a grotesque way, but as a form of communal blessing. That's the first scholarly debate you're stepping into. Sacred sexual rituals, literal or theatrical. The line between performance and participation isn't clear in ancient records, and our modern discomfort with combining sex and the sacred only complicates things further. What is known, though, is that these rites were treated with immense reverence. They were recorded, celebrated, even imitated, and that tells you something. Want a fringe fact to sweeten the mystery? Some researchers believe that the temple priestesses, known as Naditu or Kadishtu, were actually celibate and lived in temple quarters their entire lives. Others believe they were sexual initiators, educating nobles and future priests in the divine use of touch, breath, and pleasure. Still others think they were both, abstinent at times, ecstatic at others. Basically, what you're dealing with is a role more complex than priestess or courtesan. These were women who held ritual, religious, and at times political power through their bodies, their knowledge, and their place at the center of temple life. And you can feel that energy now. You're drawn deeper into the temple's heart where the air thickens and time goes slack. Candles flicker against polished bronze. There's a low hum, chanting maybe, or something older than language. You're no longer sure what's sacred and what's sensual, or if there's even a difference. You pass a chamber where a group of initiates sit cross-legged, eyes closed, palms facing upward. Their breathing is synchronized, slow and deep, like a collective heartbeat. A priestess walks among them, anointing foreheads with oil. The scent is sharp and sweet, laced with something earthy, perhaps opium, perhaps just frankincense. She pauses beside you, smiles, places 2 fingers against your temple. You feel warmth flood your limbs, not arousal exactly, but something adjacent, something holy, and that's when it hits you. These rituals weren't about indulgence, they were about presence, about weaving body and spirit so tightly that the divine could enter through either door. Inanna wasn't just being honoured, she was being embodied, she was becoming. As the drums rise in tempo and a chorus joins the hymn, you step back into shadow, heart beating a little faster. You've seen the sacred marriage of gods enacted by humans. You've felt the heat of belief, the gravity of ancient intention, and even if you're not sure what's real or reconstructed, you know this. The temple wasn't a place where the body was denied. It was where it was perfected, sanctified, and elevated into something more. And Inanna, she's still watching, still whispering, somewhere between a moan and a hymn. You're still humming with the echoes of Inanna when the scene shifts again, like a dream that folds in on itself. The scent of frankincense fades, the mud brick melts into marble, and the air turns dry with the dusty heat of another ancient city, one more sophisticated, more structured, and also a little more suspicious. You've landed in Babylon, sometime in the 1st millennium BCE, where the temples are grander, the politics stickier, and the lines between divinity and statecraft even blurrier. Here, the rituals that once thrived in intimacy have become institutional. And you're about to walk into the heart of a controversy that still divides historians like it's a sacred cage match. The temple complex ahead is massive, dedicated to Ishtar, the Babylonian version of Inanna. She's kept her wild beauty, her warrior's stance, her insatiable appetite for love and war, but now she's operating under a tighter leash. As you pass through carved gates, you spot reliefs of lions and lovers, starburst crowns, and women holding lotuses with unreadable expressions. The city is bustling. Trade routes coil through the streets, scribes scratch contracts into clay, and somewhere, high atop the ziggurat, priests peer into the stars, trying to guess what kind of week the king's going to have, but you're looking for something else. You've heard stories, accounts passed from Greek historians who claimed that every woman in Babylon was required to perform ritual sex once in her life at Ishtar's temple. They called it sacred prostitution, and if your eyebrows just shot up, yeah, same. According to Herodotus, women would sit outside the temple and wait for a stranger to toss a coin into their lap. Once that happened, they'd enter the sacred space and complete the act, after which the ritual obligation was fulfilled and the woman could return to her life with the god's blessing and hopefully a healthy womb. It's a wild claim, and to be fair, Herodotus also claimed dog-headed men lived in India. So, grain of salt. Still, it's an idea that stuck. The image of ancient women lined up at temple steps performing religious sex as a duty has proved irresistible to scholars and armchair historians alike. Some call it empowerment, others call it state-mandated sexual servitude dressed in divine robes. You're now stepping straight into the heart of that scholarly debate. Inside the temple courtyard, women dressed in crimson robes sit quietly under shaded colonnades. Their heads are covered, but their eyes are sharp. They don't look passive. In fact, they look like they're waiting for someone to ask the wrong question so they can correct them with a dagger hidden in a sandal. A priestess with silver rings stacked up her arms approaches you carrying a clay tablet. She speaks softly but firmly, and it's not a greeting, it's a reminder. This space belongs to the goddess. All acts performed here, even the most intimate, are offerings. So here's the core question historians keep wrestling with. Were these women willing participants in a sacred practice, or were they victims of a system that used religion to control bodies? The answer, frustratingly, is yes, or maybe, or both. Some texts describe temple women, Kaidishtu, Ishtaratu, and Karkidutu, with reverence, noting their education, their ritual importance, and their high status in the temple hierarchy. Others hint at a different reality. These women were sometimes given to the temple by families, essentially pledged for life, which doesn't exactly scream consent. Still others were landowners, literate, and autonomous. And here's where it gets murky. Not all temple women were involved in sexual rites. Some were administrators, some healers, some singers, some celibate, and some weren't. There's also a deliciously weird twist. The Babylonian temples had an elite group of asinu, male temple attendants who, according to some records, took on feminine roles, wore women's clothing, and performed rituals of both sensuality and spirit. Were they early trans priests, sacred eunuchs, queer initiates in a society that had more fluid views on gender than we give them credit for? Scholars can't agree, but the fact that they existed and were honoured in songs and statues tells you a lot about how far from modern norms these ancient societies really were. And here's your quirky fringe fact for tonight. In some temple rites, offerings weren't just fruit and wine, but perfumed oils rubbed into the skin, songs sung during acts of intimacy, and even, brace yourself, ritual flatulence. That's right. Some hymns to Ishtar describe wind passed in ecstasy as joyful sounds that bring laughter to the goddess. You can't make this stuff up. Or, well, ancient poets did. Back to your temple stroll. The atmosphere here is surprisingly formal. Where the temple of Inanna in Uruk felt wild and electric, this space hums with a bureaucracy. There are ledgers, scribes, priests with tablets, recording offerings down to the last fig. Even the sensuality feels contained, official. You peek into a chamber where a ritual is underway, candles burning low, a woman and man facing each other across a shallow pool. They move slowly, mirroring one another's breath. The act isn't mechanical, but it's clearly choreographed. Sacred, yes, but with rules. And that's the uncomfortable truth you're walking away with. Not all forbidden pleasure was free pleasure. When the temple becomes the state, the goddess becomes a civil servant, and ecstasy might just be another duty checked off a clay to-do list. But maybe, just maybe, that's not the whole story. Because as you leave the temple and glance back over your shoulder, one of the priestesses meets your eye and smiles, not kindly, not seductively, but knowingly, like she understands something you don't yet grasp, like she's playing a longer game, and maybe she is. Maybe in these rituals, even within the constraints of control and expectation, there was still power. A kind of power modern people forgot how to see. After all, pleasure, especially when it's sacred, is hard to define and harder to own. But these temple women, they wrote the earliest chapters, and they left the ending deliberately unfinished. You don't even feel the moment the landscape changes. One breath you're surrounded by the dry order of Babylon, and the next, you're blinking in the soft golden light of a forested grove, lush, damp, alive. The chirping of birds replaces the clatter of scribes' tablets. The scent of sandalwood gives way to jasmine and moss. A breeze wraps around your body like silk. You've been transported to central India, somewhere around the 10th century CE, in a region where stone doesn't just hold up buildings, it tells stories. Specifically, the Khajuraho temples, a place where eroticism is literally etched into the walls. You've seen the pictures before, maybe, or maybe just a few carvings posted online with snickering captions. The ones where gods and mortals, men and women, and yes, even groups you'd need a diagram to decode, twist and emerge into scenes of explicit acrobatic intensity. But standing here, in front of these stone masterpieces rising from the earth like sacred sculptures, you realize you've misunderstood the vibe completely. The Khajuraho temples aren't naughty. They're divine. They're not hidden. They're proud. And what's most surprising, they're not even built as pleasure houses. They're full-on temples, dedicated to deities like Shiva, Vishnu, and the divine feminine in her many forms. Which means all those steamy carvings, they're not an accident. They're the point. As you run your hand along the warm sandstone, you realize the carvings aren't just clustered into one adult section like some ancient red light district. They're woven into the very structure. Sensual figures spiraling up the pillars, or interlaced with celestial dancers, musicians, and mythic beasts. Every inch of the temple breathes, and every carving seems to whisper, "This too is sacred." But the real question that hangs in the humid air is why? Why did the Chandler dynasty, who commissioned these temples, dedicate such enormous time, money, and devotion to carvings that would get most modern artists banned on social media? Some theories suggest these images served as a kind of cosmic instruction manual, a visual guide to tantric principles where sexual energy wasn't seen as distraction, but as liberation. Others argue the temples were a celebration of the full human experience, not just its spiritual heights, but also its carnal depths. Body and soul, no hierarchy, no shame. A few even claim that the carvings were deliberate spiritual tests. If you were distracted by the outer erotic imagery, you might never reach the inner sanctum, where the true God waited in silence. But here's where the scholarly debates get spicy. Some experts insist the erotic art was added later, that the temples were initially more conservative in design, and the pleasure motifs came with a cultural shift, perhaps as a form of political rebellion or satire. Others are adamant that the sensual carvings were foundational, echoing deeper tantric philosophies that once ruled the region but were later smoothed over by more buttoned-up religious movements. And then there's the weirdest theory of all, that the images were apotropaic, meant to ward off evil, like, "Hey demons, look at all this wild stuff happening here. No need to bring your chaos, we've already got plenty," which is either brilliant or hilarious, possibly both. You step into the inner temple and the energy changes again. Outside, bodies writhe in stone ecstasy. Inside, it's quiet, cool, and still. You're standing in front of a statue of Shiva, not as a distant god, but as Ardhanarishvara, half male, half female, a perfect androgynous form expressing unity. It's a spiritual mic drop. You've just walked through the sensual to reach the sublime, and this is where things get especially delicious. In Tantric philosophy, which heavily influenced the Khajuraho aesthetic, the journey to enlightenment isn't about denial, it's about integration. The body is a tool, not a temptation. Pleasure is a gateway, not a detour. Through carefully guided rituals, breath control, movement, eye contact, and even sexual union, practitioners were believed to transcend the physical and enter altered states of divine consciousness. Now don't get ahead of yourself. What happened in these temples was likely not an all-day orgy with incense and a priest narrating positions from a podium. Tantric rituals were, and still are, highly structured, often private and sometimes completely non-sexual. The erotic art? Think of it less as a literal scene and more as a sacred metaphor. A cosmic drama played out on stone, gods and humans entwined not in lust but in unity. Still, you can't deny the heat that radiates from these walls. The artisans weren't vague, they didn't pull punches. There's a clarity as to their work that suggests not only deep technical skill, but also cultural acceptance. They weren't hiding anything. The idea that these carvings were shameful, that came later, with colonizers, moral reformers, and modern discomforts projecting backward. Here's your fringe fact for the night. One of the lesser discussed temples in the complex, the Chausath Yogini temple, doesn't just honor female deities. It's rumored to have been used for ritual sex magic. Hidden atop a hill and aligned with celestial bodies, Some believe this site hosted sacred rites between initiated pairs combining breath, mantra, and union as offerings to yoginis, divine feminine spirits who refuse to be tamed. It's unproven, of course, just whispers, but stand there long enough and your skin starts to tingle. And now for the ongoing debate that keeps buzzing in the academic corners. Did the Khajuraho temples reflect a mainstream cultural norm, or were they an outlier, an elite experiment in open spirituality? Some argue these temples were deeply rooted in tantric sects that represented only a fraction of the population. Others say they reflect a broader, now-lost acceptance of sensuality in Indian religion, before waves of foreign invasions and moral conservatism shifted the narrative. As you sit on the temple steps, watching the sunlight slide across the carvings, you wonder what it would be like to live in a world where pleasure wasn't hidden or demonized, but carved into the walls of your holiest places, where sex wasn't a secret but a symbol of sacred union, where bodies weren't distractions from the divine but expressions of it. The jungle stirs, a peacock cries in the distance, and from deep inside the temple a wind moves, not loud, not forceful, just a sigh, like stone exhaling. You stay seated for a moment longer, soaking in the heat radiating from the sandstone, letting the memory of those tangled bodies carved in stone dissolve into something more than just sensual curiosity. Then the ground seems to hum beneath you, not shake, just thrum, like a distant chant echoing through layers of time. When you blink again, the sun-drenched temple dissolves into the shadows, the forest grows denser, vines creep across mossy stone, the scent of jasmine lingers, but it's mixed now with something smokier. Like incense burned so long that it became part of the architecture. You've moved into another realm, still Indian, still sacred, but deeper, stranger. This isn't Khajuraho anymore. This is the world of tantric mysticism, not the version on yoga posters, but the real thing. Dangerous, wild, holy. That the first thing you notice is the sound, not music exactly, but breath. Controlled, rhythmic, purposeful. You're standing just outside a small candlelit chamber where two figures sit facing each other on a low platform. Their hands mirror one another. Their spines are impossibly straight. Their eyes locked, unblinking. Around them, intricate geometric patterns, yantras, are drawn in chalk and flower petals. A slow chant loops beneath their breathwork, deep and primal. You're not sure what's happening, but it vibrates in your bones. This is not sex, at least not in any conventional sense. This is ritualized energetic union, the central practice of Tantra, a spiritual system born in India and Tibet that doesn't see the body as an obstacle to divinity, but as a vessel of it. And yes, some forms of Tantra include sexual union as spiritual ritual, but it's not about climax, it's about transcendence through total presence. And it's a lot more disciplined than anyone trying to sell you tantric massage on the internet is going to admit. In this temple, half ruined, half alive, you begin to understand the deeper architecture behind those carvings at Khajuraho. Those weren't instructions, they were invitations. The physical act into Tantra is just one of many doors. Breath, mantra, visualization, stillness, each technique opens the body as a channel, not a toy. The pleasure isn't the goal, the dissolution of boundaries is. Between man and woman, self and other, body and cosmos. But let's not get too dreamy. Tantra, for all its depth, is notoriously hard to define. Some schools never include sex at all. Others treat it as central. Some practices are open to householders, others reserved for initiates in isolated lineages. The only consistent thread? Nothing is excluded. Shadow, fear, pleasure, pain, all are embraced, explored, ritualized. That's what makes Tantra so forbidden and fascinating. It refuses to draw neat lines between sacred and profane. Here's your historical anchor for this section. One of the earliest tantric texts to openly discuss these rites is the Inanna, attributed to the mystic Matsyendranath. In it, sexual union is presented as a means to awaken Kundalini, the coiled energy at the base of the spine, through a balanced fusion of masculine and feminine energies. But again, this wasn't some casual date night. These rituals were rare, performed with strict guidance, and only after years of preparation. Imagine having to master meditation, fasting, esoteric chants, and probably your own childhood trauma before being deemed ready to have divine sex. Kind of puts Tinder into perspective. You move deeper into the temple, stepping carefully around flower petals and powdered turmeric scattered across the floor in spiral patterns. In a corner chamber, a Dakini statue watches you, a fierce goddess figure with wild hair, fangs, and bare breasts. She holds a skull bowl in one hand and a curved blade in the other. Not exactly the tender embodiment of romance, but in Tantra she represents transformation through confrontation. To reach bliss, you have to walk through fear. To find unity, you must dissolve ego. She isn't here to seduce, she's here to initiate. And now, for the fringe fact of the night, some tantric sects engaged in rituals so taboo they were known as the 5 M's: madhya, wine; mamsa, meat; matsya, fish; mudra, and grain; and maithuna, sexual union. These were not indulgences, but tests. Each item represented something forbidden in traditional Hindu practice. Consuming or engaging with them was meant to shatter illusion, to free the practitioner from cultural and spiritual limitations. Were these rites symbolic or literal? The debate is as alive as ever. Which leads us into tonight's scholarly debate. Did ancient tantric sexual rites actually happen? Or were they metaphorical meditations taken too literally by outsiders? Some academics argue that everything described in tantric texts, from sexual union to corpse meditation, was symbolic, intended as inner visualization. Others claim it was absolutely real, performed by secret sects in forest temples and cremation grounds. There's evidence both ways. Artifacts, songs, temple inscriptions, but also centuries of poetic metaphor. It's like trying to determine whether the serpent in the Garden of Eden was a literal snake or an archetypal force of temptation. Depends who you ask. Depends what you're willing to believe. What's undeniable is this. The energetic framework of Tantra still echoes in modern practices. Chakras, breathwork. Even the idea of raising energy through focus and presence. It all comes from these early mystics who dared to use their bodies as altars. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy that's half-whispered wisdom, half-misunderstood mystery. You find yourself at the very back of the temple now, in a vaulted chamber carved with lotus motifs and ringed in flickering oil lamps. There's a platform in the centre, empty but charged. This is the ritual seat, the place where energy was raised, exchanged and offered. The air here is thick, not with incense but with the memory. You sit, just for a second, and suddenly you understand the point wasn't the act itself, it was the presence, the absolute surrender to the moment. No distraction, no ego, just being completely. With another, or with the divine, you rise slowly, almost dizzy, and exit the temple into cool night air. Crickets sing in the trees. Somewhere in the darkness, a conch shell sounds, and inside you, something soft and electric is still stirring. Pleasure is a portal, sacred not because it's rare, but because it's complete. And this is only one flavour of Tantra. One temple, one key on a massive ring of forbidden, forgotten ways of worshipping through the body. You wake up before you ever meant to fall asleep, or maybe you never slept at all, just drifted. The boundary between dream and memory is wearing thin, and you're starting to realise that following these ancient rituals isn't about walking forward, it's more like falling backward, through layers of smoke, silk and sound. Now, as the temple dissolves around you like incense in the wind, you find yourself under an open sky once more, surrounded by dry grass and low stone walls. It's morning in early Vedic India, a time before statues and temples ruled the landscape. Here, the sacred lives in fire, in rhythm, in words, and you're about to whisper some that haven't been spoken aloud in centuries. You're sitting beside a ceremonial fire pit, its embers still glowing. All around you are low chanting voices, reciting verses from the Atharva Veda, a lesser-known cousin of the Rig Veda, and often seen as the oddball of the family. The Atharva Veda doesn't just focus on cosmic order and celestial praise. It's intimate, earthy, messy. It's the Veda of spells, protection rituals, healing incantations, and, crucially, erotic hymns. And tonight, or rather this eternal dawn you've landed in, you're here for one of those. A young priest leans toward the fire, his voice steady but not detached. He's reading from a palm leaf manuscript, his fingers stained with ash and saffron. The words he chants are soft, poetic, but undeniably physical. They speak of touch, heat, longing, of a lover's body like a flowering tree, of mouths that melt resistance, of desire as both prayer and potion. You feel the air shift. The people around the fire are no longer just observers, they're participants in a shared vision, conjured by Bhakti sound alone. Unlike the sculpted ecstasy of Khajuraho or the disciplined trance of Tantra, this moment feels more like enchantment, like someone bottled the feeling of falling in love and poured it into verse. The hymns aren't about lust, they're about longing, and how longing itself is a sacred state, how the ache for union can be just as divine as the union itself. Here's your historical anchor. Many of these hymns come from Book 4 of the Atharva Veda, which includes dozens of love charms, attraction spells, and intimate invocations. Scholars have debated their purpose for centuries. Some argue they were used in marriage ceremonies, meant to bind spouses in affection and desire. Others believe they were used to win over lovers, cast like romantic spells with the same urgency as battle magic or protective chants. Just a casual hex to make your crush think you're hot. One such hymn goes like this: "May this woman burn for me with love as the fire burns wood." Not exactly subtle, but somehow there's reverence in the rawness. It's not about conquest, it's about alignment, about creating harmony between bodies and fates. And here's your fringe fact for tonight: spicy and sweet. Some Vedic scholars believe these erotic hymns may have been sung not just in domestic settings, but in early ritual spaces, possibly under open skies, as part of seasonal fertility ceremonies. Imagine villagers gathered at the turn of spring, chanting intimate verses into the rising wind, hoping to awaken not just their own desires, but the earth's. Arousal as agriculture, pleasure as prosperity. The idea might sound far-fetched, but remember, in early cultures, the boundaries between body and land weren't philosophical, they were survival. But of course, not everyone agrees. This leads us straight into the scholarly tug-of-war still raging quietly in dusty university libraries. Were these hymns spiritual tools, or just folk love songs that got canonized by accident? One side says they're mystical, encoded with symbolic meaning that links desire to the soul's journey. The other says, nah, they're just clever ancient poems that snuck into the big leagues because someone's great-grandfather thought they were catchy. Both camps make solid points, and meanwhile the hymns themselves just sit there in the old books, blushing eternally in Sanskrit. You lean back, listening to the rising rhythm of the chant. The priests aren't just reading, they're casting. Each verse lands like a soft drumbeat against the skin, and you can see the listeners swaying slightly, eyes half closed. No one's undressing, there are no carvings or candles, and yet there's tension in the air, a gentle pull, like gravity, but hornier. This isn't a space where physical union happens, it's where the possibility of it is suspended in the air like a spell. And isn't that the real magic? Not the act, but the moment before the act, the charged pause, the breath held. One priest finishes his verse and walks to a woman sitting quietly at the edge of the fire circle. She nods, and he smears red powder across her forehead. Not a romantic gesture, not overtly. But there's something intimate in the way her gaze doesn't break from his. You wonder if they were paired for a ritual, or if the words just hit a little too close tonight. In the background, someone begins playing a bamboo flute, a low, wavering sound that seems to wander on its own. The tempo of the chanting slows. You can feel the ceremony beginning to wind down, but there's no clear ending, like a soft kiss that never quite lands. Before the embers fade, one final hymn is spoken, not chanted. It's almost whispered, and for a second you're not sure if it's coming from the priest or from inside your own thoughts. As the fire draws the moth, so draw her heart to mine, not with force, but with the warmth of longing. You sit there long after the others have risen, the sky above you now a soft blue-grey, no temples, no golden statues. Just the earth beneath you, and the echo of a verse about wanting someone so gently that even the gods pause to listen. And in that quiet, you understand something. The oldest form of sacred pleasure may not be in the act at all. It might be in the yearning, in the way a word can make your skin shiver, in the way your breath can stir the air between you and someone else like a prayer. The morning fades behind you, and time folds again, soft and seamless, like silk sliding off a shoulder. The fire of the Vedic ritual dissolves, replaced by a different heat, coastal, sticky, and tinged with salt. You're in ancient Greece now, standing on a hillside overlooking the bright Aegean Sea. Below, the port city of Corinth buzzes with life, traders haggling in open markets, bronze clinking against marble. The cries of gulls tangled with laughter and flute music, but your destination sits above all of it, watching from its perch like a cat that knows it's divine. The temple of Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and oh yes, pleasure. The Acrocorinth towers in the distance, its slopes steep and sun-bleached. You climb slowly, the heat clinging to your skin, sandals kicking up dust. By the time you reach the top, your thighs are burning and your shirt is sticking in ways that aren't entirely unpleasant. And there it is. The temple itself, relatively small by Greek standards, but luminous. The stone is warm to the touch, smooth as bone, and it hums faintly under your hand. Inside, the air shifts. It always does in places like this. You don't see statues of Aphrodite with flowing robes and coquettish smiles. No, here she stands strong, nearly nude, draped in little more than gold jewellery and confidence. Her face is serene, but her eyes are knowing. She is not a goddess of mere flirtation, she is the ruler of intimate chaos, of desire that upends kingdoms, of longing that can't be reasoned with. But let's address the elephant in the marble room. This temple is famous, infamous really, for its alleged practice of sacred prostitution. You've heard the stories, the whispers, that over 1,000 hierodules or sacred courtesans served Aphrodite here, offering themselves to travellers in exchange for donations to the temple. That these women were not shamed but revered, and their erotic service considered an offering to the goddess herself. The Roman historian Strabo swears this was true. So do other ancient writers, who seem both scandalized and aroused by the idea. And in a city as wealthy and bustling as Corinth, a centre for trade, sex, and spirituality often mingled in the same breath. The idea of divine love being channeled through human touch. Perfectly reasonable to the people of the time, especially if it pleased the goddess, especially if it pleased the economy. But, cue the scholarly arguments, modern historians aren't so sure. Was this sacred sex real, or just a spicy misinterpretation? Some believe the term hierodule has been mistranslated, that these women were temple servants, yes, but not necessarily sex workers. Others suggest that while formalized sacred prostitution may not have existed, Corinth was full of elite courtesans who blurred the lines between worship and commerce, spirit and body. In a port town like this, blurred lines were practically currency. One thing is clear, Aphrodite's temples were deeply entwined with sensuality, whether or not intercourse took place under official temple policy. Her festivals were filled with dancing, music, and feasting. During certain rites, like the Aphrodisia, worshippers would process through the streets with flowers in their hair, offerings in hand, and a barely restrained sense of mischief in their step. You wouldn't be surprised if a few garments slipped off during the celebration. You're also not sure the goddess would mind. You wander into the temple's rear courtyard, where olive trees sway lazily in the breeze. A small stone basin catches sunlight, rippling with water from a sacred spring. A woman kneels beside it, her hands cupped, face radiant. She isn't a priestess, just a pilgrim, but the way she touches the water suggests reverence. Or maybe she's remembering someone. Aphrodite's followers often came to her temples to pray for love returned, marriages mended, or desires granted. They offered roses, perfumes, and locks of hair, and sometimes they offered themselves. That brings us to the role of the Hetairai, elite courtesans in ancient Greece who were more than companions. They were philosophers, artists, muses. Educated and unattached by law to any man, they moved freely in a world where most women were cloistered. Some of them were regular visitors, perhaps even unofficial priestesses at temples like this. They lived outside the lines, in that delicious space where sensuality and intellect met. And you can feel their ghostly presence here, in the way the marble holds echoes of laughter, debate, and perhaps the rustle of silk bedsheets. Time for tonight's fringe fact. There are inscriptions found near ancient Greek temples that detail curses written by rejected lovers, asking Aphrodite to torment unfaithful exes or make someone fall hopelessly in love. These were scratched into lead tablets and buried near altars. Divine love wasn't always soft and glowing, it had claws. Worshippers treated it like wildfire, beautiful but wildly uncontrollable. Now for the scholarly debate still simmering like honey over a flame. Was Aphrodite a goddess of erotic empowerment or a tool, used to justify transactional sex. Some argue that her temples were sacred spaces where love and sensuality were uplifted, given dignity. Others suggest that invoking her name offered a religious cover for what was essentially economic exploitation, especially of women. As usual, the truth may lie in the tension. Worship doesn't always erase power dynamics, but it can sometimes reclaim them. You sit for a moment on a sun-warmed bench, watching the sea shimmer in the distance. Sailors down below toast their deals with wine. A few are already climbing the path toward the temple, hopeful, maybe seeking wisdom, maybe more. One of the temple attendants walks by, barefoot, hair braided with olive leaves, eyes calm. She nods at you, and for a flicker of a second, it's as if you see Aphrodite herself in her posture. Not in the flesh exactly, but in the radiance, the confidence, the knowing smile that says, yes, you may worship, but only if you understand what you're asking for. Because love in these temples wasn't sweetened for your comfort. It was offered raw, like the sea, like the body, like a truth that doesn't care if you're ready. The salt wind fades from your skin, and with it the shining terraces of Aphrodite's temple drift into the haze. You descend from the Corinth, but you don't return to the noisy agora below. Instead, you drift sideways, through time, through breath, through smoke. The sound of clinking goblets and sailors' laughter dims into a hush broken only by the rustling of silk. You now find yourself inside a space that smells like honeyed wine and warm skin. No columns here, no statues, just low couches, shadowed lamplight, and a voice laughing somewhere behind a curtain. You've stepped into a private salon in classical Athens, and she is already waiting for you. She leans on one elbow, her robe deliberately loose, one foot idly swaying as if to music only she can hear. Her name might be Aspasia, or it might be a dozen others forgotten to the ages. She is a Hetairai, class of courtesan unlike any other. Not a prostitute, not a wife, and certainly not a servant. She exists outside the conventional categories, which is exactly where her power lives. And tonight, she's going to teach you how pleasure, philosophy, and influence could all exist in one honey-voiced body. Unlike the wives of Athens, who were confined mostly to the home and spoken of with vague reverence but little actual respect, Hetairai were educated, free-thinking, and able to speak publicly. They were trained in rhetoric, music, poetry, and the fine art of knowing when to listen and when to laugh. But make no mistake, they were not just companions for pillow talk. Many of them moved in political circles, influenced poets, and whispered into the ears of generals. Take Aspasia herself, lover and possibly wife of Pericles, the most powerful statesman in Athens. She wasn't just his consort. She was rumoured to have written parts of his speeches. Socrates is said to have visited her not for physical pleasure, but for conversation. Imagine that, being so compelling, philosophers put down their questions to hear your answers. That's not seduction. That's strategy. You sip from a shallow wine cup as she speaks, her fingers tracing the edge. She talks about the gods with irreverent affection, about politics with weary amusement, and about love with unnerving precision. A man who fears pleasure, she says, is either lying or broken. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't need to. The entire room leans toward her, including you. And this is the part of ancient sacred pleasure that often gets skipped over. Intellectual seduction. The Hetairai didn't just trade in physical delight, they curated experiences. Long nights of music, wit, arguments over Sir Plato, poetry composed on the spot. They understood that desire isn't just in the body, it's in the mind. And if they could touch that, the rest would follow. Here's your historical nugget to tuck under the pillow. The Greek term Hetairai literally means female companion, and though the term included women who provided sexual services, it also encompassed a much broader role. Many were trained from a young age, not only in performance but also in conversation and politics. Unlike the enslaved prostitutes of the brothels, pornai, or Hetairai were often freed women or foreigners who earned considerable wealth and sometimes even owned property. A few had temples dedicated in their name. That's not just rare in a patriarchal society, it's revolutionary. Fringe fact time, there are surviving love letters and erotic poetry from male philosophers to Hetairai that read like fan fiction, written by emotionally overwhelmed students. One particularly amusing scrap from an Athenian bureaucrat to a Hetairai named Croesus begs for her return. The wine has no sweetness without your laughter in my ears. My bed remains cold even when the sun warms the room. which, okay, is either incredibly romantic or deeply sad, or both. But now, let's wade into the scholarly debate. Were Hetairai truly empowered women, or just another variation of controlled femininity wrapped in prettier chains? It's a question that haunts every corner of history. On one side, these women clearly had more freedom and agency than most others in their society. They could own property, argue with politicians, and even deny clients. But on the other hand, their value was still intimately tied to male desire, to the performance of intelligence and sensuality for male approval. Was that power, or just an illusion of it? Some feminist historians argue that Hetairai represent a fleeting golden sliver of female autonomy in a deeply misogynistic world. Others see them as a brilliant but ultimately trapped class, allowed to shine only so long as they entertained. Maybe both are true, maybe that's the tension they danced with every night. As Aspasia, or her shadow, leans in close to refill your wine, you feel that tension ripple through the room. Her smile is not flirtation, it's a test. Do you recognise the game? Do you think she's here for your amusement? Or is she using you to stage another performance entirely? In the corner of the salon, a small lyre begins to play. Another Hetairai sings softly, her voice brushing over the space like velvet. The lyrics are old but familiar, about a love too dangerous to name, about a body remembered in silence. The atmosphere thickens, not with lust, but with the ache of recognition. Everyone here knows what it means to be wanted, but not owned. And that is perhaps the most sacred part of all this, the refusal to disappear. In a world where most women's voices are silenced, the Hetairei's very existence is a defiant hymn. Every laugh, every debate, every well-placed sigh is part of a ritual. A slow-burning offering, not to a god, but to selfhood. As the lamplight flickers low, you realise you don't want to leave. Not because of the sex, which may or may not ever happen, but because of the presence. This woman, this mind, this room, they are all fully awake, and that kind of awareness, that's the rarest pleasure of all. You rise reluctantly and bow your head. She watches you go with the same unreadable smile, not victorious, not wistful, just aware. She knows you'll remember her, not her name, not her bait, but the way she made you feel, seen. The wine-dark salon fades, but the echo of her voice clings to your skin like fine silk. That smile, half challenge, half farewell, follows you into the dark as time peels away again, like parchment paint burned from the edges. There's no hard landing this time. No burst of sunlight or fanfare, just cold stone beneath your feet, the smell of damp earth and the sound of chanting, low, rhythmic and cloaked in mystery. You're underground now, somewhere deep in the ancient Mediterranean world. And above you, a sacred secret is being kept. Welcome to the hidden world of mystery cults, and more specifically, the forbidden rites of initiation nights, rituals whispered about but rarely witnessed, known only to the initiated and the brave. This particular chamber belongs to the cult of Demeter and Persephone, a group whose Eleusinian mysteries were among the most sacred and tightly guarded in the ancient world. Outside, they preached agriculture, rebirth, and the turning of the seasons. But down here, in the torchlit caverns below, something else happened, something personal, something forbidden to speak of under penalty of death. And tonight, for reasons unknown, you've been allowed in, just don't make too much noise. The air is thick with smoke and tension. You can see others around you, cloaked figures in silence, breathing as one. Ahead, veiled priestesses hold torches and bowls of grain. It feels like a funeral crossed with an orgy of symbols, a sacred theatre where everything is real but nothing is explained. You're not given a script. You're meant to feel your way through it. The mystery is the point. And here's where the sensual tension creeps in. Because even though these rituals are not explicitly sexual, at least not publicly, there's an undeniable charge humming through the space. You've heard rumours that initiates may have experienced symbolic death and rebirth through physical union, that some rites involve the ceremonial joining of male and female energies embodied by the Hierophant and the High Priestess. There's no proof, there's no denial either. What you're left with is a slow-burning uncertainty, and frankly, a lot of ancient jealousy from historians who weren't invited. Let's anchor this in the actual historical practice. The Eleusinian mysteries, celebrated annually for nearly 2,000 years, were open only to initiates who had completed months of preparation. What happened in the inner sanctum, the telesterion, was never written down. All we know is that it involved darkness, light, a sacred object, and an overwhelming revelation. Some initiates described it as the most profound experience of their lives. Others never spoke of it again. Either way, something happened in that hall, and it wasn't just a slideshow of wheat farming tips. Now, let's toss in your fringe fact for the night, straight from the weirder corners of the academic basement. Some fringe scholars believe the Eleusinian drink, kykeon, was not just barley water, but a psychoactive brew, possibly laced with ergot, a fungus from which LSD is derived. If that theory holds any water, then what the initiates saw might not have been just symbolic. It may have been deeply visionary, even erotic in the way only ego death and mystic union can be, and yes, that would explain why nobody wanted to talk about it afterward. You're led through a narrow tunnel, the ceiling low enough to make you bow involuntarily. The metaphor isn't lost on you. Humility, submission, the slow crawl toward truth. Ahead you hear water dripping, and then a voice, not commanding, not pleading, but full of invocation. It's in a language you don't recognize, but your body understands it. Every syllable lands like a soft touch, tracing the spine, warming the belly. The priestess is singing, and the song winds around the chamber like smoke. As you step into the ritual chamber, you see a strange tableau. Two figures standing face to face, arms raised, not touching but vibrating with energy. Between them, a flame dances in a bronze bowl, throwing long shadows on the walls. The room pulses with anticipation, not of action but of revelation. It's as if the entire rite is an elaborate flirtation with the divine, a slow striptease of illusion, until only truth remains. And that truth? It might just look like a body. The debate surrounding mystery cults is as feverish as the rituals themselves. Were these rites of sacred union or spiritual theatre? Did the ancient Greeks and Romans really believe in physical reenactments of mythic events? Persephone's abduction, Demeter's grief, their eventual reunion? Or were these symbolic rituals of the soul's journey? Some argue the presence of phalli, womb symbols, and erotic poetry woven into the initiation rites point towards sensual dramatizations of myth. Others argue it's all just allegory, ancient spirituality getting unfairly sexualized by modern minds desperate to find kink in every corner. But here's what they often forget. Those initiates weren't modern. They weren't filtering the sacred through shame. For them, the body was a vehicle, not a liability. Union, sexual, spiritual, emotional, was one of the oldest metaphors for transcending the self, and the act of entering a dark room, witnessing a veil lifted, a light kindled, a secret revealed. That's the structure of seduction and spiritual awakening. They are not mutually exclusive. They never were. You kneel near the edge of the chamber, your breath slowing to match the rhythm around you. Something opens inside your chest, subtle but undeniable. You don't feel aroused exactly. You feel seen. Seen in a way that has nothing to do with nakedness and everything to do with vulnerability, with stepping into the unknown willingly, with the heat that comes not from touch but from truth. And maybe that's the real forbidden ritual here. Not sex, not drugs, but clarity, the kind that strips you down more thoroughly than any physical act ever could. You realize the deepest pleasure in this chamber isn't about climax, it's about being undone and letting the gods remake you. The torchlight dims, the song fades, the veil drops again. You're not sure what you saw, but you know it changed you. And when the priestess turns, locking eyes with you one last time, there's no seduction in her gaze, just knowing. You are part of something tonight, and you will never fully understand it. That's what makes it Symbolic sacred. When the last ember fades and you finally emerge from the subterranean temple, it's as if you've been reborn. Your skin feels thin, almost translucent, as if something in the ritual scraped away a layer you hadn't known you were carrying. But there's no time to sit with the feeling. The air has shifted again, warmer now, and filled with the rhythmic crash of water against stone. You're standing on the banks of the Nile, and the sun is just beginning to sink into its golden hour drama. This is Egypt, not the sterile, tomb-bound version in schoolbooks, but the living, laughing, sweating Egypt of the fertility festivals, where ecstasy and agriculture dance in step. Behind you rises a white stone temple glowing amber in the evening light, dedicated to Min, the god of fertility. You may not recognize him at first, but when you do, you really do. Min is often portrayed with an erect phallus, standing tall, literally and figuratively, as a symbol of virility and power. Not subtle, not ashamed, just there, and not tucked away in private corners either, carved on the walls of temples, paraded in festivals, and even painted on the walls of tombs. You're not here for prudish metaphors. You're here for an unfiltered celebration of life in all its sweaty, earthy forms. People are gathering and there's an unmistakable buzz in the air. It's the Feast of the Valley, a springtime festival honouring not just Min, but also the goddess Hathor, patron of joy, music, love, drunkenness, and yes, erotic pleasure. If Aphrodite is a slow seduction, Hathor is a full-body laugh that ends with someone losing a sandal and waking up with flowers in their hair. The Nile is high, the air ripe with blossoms and beer, and these people are ready to get wild, in the name of the gods, of course. Vessels of wine, often home-brewed, dangerously strong, are passed around with eager hands. Music starts, not formal hymns, but throbbing drums and sharp high flutes. You hear laughter, the kind that breaks open your ribs, and see dancers adorned in beaded skirts and gold cuffs, moving with hips that clearly understand gravity in more interesting ways than physics books can explain. In the crowd, you spot a group of women, priestesses of Hathor, their hair braided with lotus flowers, leading chants. Their songs aren't restrained or solemn. They're raucous, earthy, and filled with double meanings. You catch fragments, may your fields overflow, let the flood rise, drink deep and forget your name. Not very subtle, but nothing about tonight is. Here's a slice of historical truth for your ritual plate. During major Egyptian festivals, especially those honouring fertility deities, sexual play, drinking, and public displays of affection were not only common, they were expected. This wasn't debauchery in the modern sense, it was sacred release. A way to reset the cosmic balance through joy, laughter, and bodily pleasure. The annual flooding of the Nile was interpreted as divine arousal, and the health of the crops depended on that ecstatic alignment. Enter the festival's most famous moment, the raising of the Djed. It's a ceremony where a pillar, representing the backbone of Osiris and symbolically an erect phallus, is hoisted into place by priests and worshippers. It's done with chants, music, and loud celebration. The Djed is not hidden or whispered about. It is erected, literally and ceremonially, before thousands. Not as something lewd, but as something holy. A world built on shame would struggle to process this. Ancient Egypt, they threw a party. Fringe fact of the night, there's a lesser-known ritual called the Festival of Drunkenness, linked to the myth where Hathor was about to destroy humanity in a rage. To stop her, Ra tricked her by dyeing beer red and offering it as blood. Hathor drank it all, got blissfully drunk, passed out, and awoke in a mood more conducive to dancing than murdering. The myth was then reenacted annually, in a ceremony that involved excessive drinking, dancing, and likely some not quite public coupling. These weren't sideshows, they were main events. Rituals that blurred the line between performance and embodiment. But of course we have a debate. Were these sensual expressions truly sacred, or were they state-sponsored distractions? Some scholars suggest the fertility festivals were tools to channel sexual energy away from rebellion and toward harmless communal outlets. Others argue the rituals held deep spiritual meaning, reinforcing the cyclical relationship between sex, death, and rebirth. The Nile floods, the land is seeded, life brings forth. Pleasure here wasn't a diversion, it was a divine necessity. You're pulled into a dance circle without warning. Hands grasp yours, your hips find the rhythm, and suddenly you're moving in sync with a dozen strangers. You've never been more aware of your body, and never felt less self-conscious about it. Laughter explodes like a hymn. Someone spills wine on your foot. A priestess locks eyes with you and winks, and for a moment, the divine is real and immediate, with golden bracelets and sticky fingers. You lose track of time. There's no climax to this ritual, no ceremonial ending, just the slow winding down of drums, the fading warmth of torches, and the afterglow of collective release. You collapse on the soft earth near the Nile's edge, your clothes wrinkled, your mouth sweet with wine. Overhead, stars blaze like they're watching approvingly. And in that moment, as your breath slows and the laughter drifts into the distance, you realize something very old and very true. Pleasure was never meant to be hidden. In this ancient world, it was public, powerful, and profoundly sacred. Not a thing to apologize for, a thing to offer. The temple stands behind you now, quiet again, but the memory of the celebration lives in your limbs. You don't need to look back to know the goddess is smiling. The taste of wine still lingers on your tongue when the Nile vanishes behind you like the tail end of a dream. The beat of drums is replaced by the clink of bronze anklets, and the echo of laughter melts into a low, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps on sun-baked stone. You're in Egypt still, but deeper now, wilder. You blink and find yourself among palms and columns, in a temple made not for stately ceremony, but for something more primal. This is the domain of Hathor, yes, but not the elegant goddess carved in jewellery catalogues. This is Hathor the Reveller, the laughing cow-headed goddess of music, dancing, and unrepentant ecstasy. Welcome to the festival of drunkenness. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like, and no, you're not prepared. The sun is high overhead, too bright for what's about to happen. You can already hear the music before you see the courtyard. Sharp tambourines, ululating voices, the unmistakable shriek of a sistrum, that rattling metal instrument sacred to Hathor. The courtyard is filling with women, some dressed in white linen, others barely dressed at all. They sway, stretch, tease the air with their fingers as if stirring invisible honey. Around them, priests and musicians prepare offerings, baskets of dates, figs, and flagons of wine so potent they practically sweat. Let's rewind for context. The Festival of Drunkenness commemorates an ancient myth where Hathor, in her terrifying form as Sekhmet, was unleashed upon humanity to punish them for disobedience. But once the slaughter began, she got a little too into it. The gods panicked, so Ra, the sun god, ordered beer to be dyed red and poured across the land like blood. Sekhmet drank it, mistaking it for carnage, and got so smashed she forgot to be mad. The world was spared, and Egypt being Egypt turned it into an annual party. But this is no frat house toga bash. It's a sacred reenactment, and you can feel that in your bones as you're ushered into the crowd. The priestesses begin their invocations, voices rising with a rhythm that's not just heard but felt in your teeth. One woman stands on a pedestal, arms raised, head thrown back, her sistrum shaking like it's channeling a thunderstorm. Around her, the crowd begins to stagger. On purpose. You're encouraged to lose control. In fact, that's the whole point. And here comes your historical thread to cling to. In temple records and graffiti scratched into the walls of Hathor's sanctuaries, especially at Dendra, her main cult centre, this festival is described with euphemisms that barely hide the wildness. Words like awakening and rebirth, and becoming one with Hathor. In practice, it meant dancing until you collapsed, drinking until you forgot your own name, and in some cases, engaging in ritualized intimacy with other worshippers. Not as a sideshow, but as a sacred offering. Fringe fact: some interpretations of the rites suggest that dream incubation followed the night's intoxication. After the chaos, participants would sleep within the temple precincts, hoping to receive divine visions from Hathor herself. The idea was simple. Once your ego was softened by music, movement, and wine, the divine could slip in through the cracks. Ecstasy as divine invitation. You're deep in the celebration now. Wine is passed into your hand by a woman with gold dust smeared across her collarbones. She signals with wine-stained teeth and presses a fig into your palm. You take both. You chew slowly. Everything starts to slow down. Not in a dizzy way, but in a melting way. The drums don't seem louder, but you feel them inside your chest. A priestess brushes past, trailing perfume that smells like cinnamon and lightning. People are dancing like no one's watching, because no one is. The gods are watching. And suddenly the night breaks open. You're on the ground, not sure how you got there, gazing up at the stars now peeking through the temple's open roof. The music is distant but still there, like waves pulling at your ankles. Someone, maybe the woman from earlier, sits beside you humming. Your fingers graze hers. It's not lust, it's not romance, it's something deeper. A kind of communion. Two bodies, warm and exhausted, offered to the divine like burning incense. Not for pleasure alone, but for surrender. Now, let's dive into the scholarly argument that still causes academic side-eyes at conferences. Were these festivals celebrations of feminine liberation, or state-sanctioned chaos disguised as piety? One side argues that Hathor's festivals offered women a rare space to break free, socially, sexually and missionally, from the constraints of Egyptian patriarchy. Others counter that this freedom was tightly regulated, scripted, and ultimately just another outlet controlled by the priesthood. A safety valve, not a revolution. But you, lying here under the stars with laughter still echoing in your ears, think maybe it's both. Because here's the truth that no scroll can quite contain. People found God in the moment they forgot themselves. And in these rituals, losing control was a form of worship. The ecstatic, the erotic, the intoxicated, it was all part of the sacred, not shameful, not deviant, just real. Eventually the music slows. People are curled up in corners, wrapped in each other, in cloaks, in dreams. A priestess pours the last of the wine onto the earth and whispers something in ancient Egyptian that you don't understand, but it settles into your bones like a lullaby. You sit up, groggy but lit from the inside, and look around. The temple is quiet now, but the energy doesn't fade. It lingers in the walls, in your heartbeat, in the faint ache behind your eyes. You've witnessed a ritual not of sacrifice but of abandon, of letting go in the name of something larger. You're not sure what parts of you danced away tonight, but you're glad they did. And when the first call of an ibis breaks the dawn, you realise something sacred has happened. You just won't be able to explain it, and that's what makes it real. The Temple of Hathor fades behind you like the final notes of a song you didn't realise you were humming. Your limbs are still loose, your breath slow, and your mind, that delicious tangle of memory and dream, wanders freely as the landscape around you shifts once more. Gone is the Nile, gone is the warm haze of wine and wild abandon. Now you're surrounded by cool stone and strange geometry, all smooth curves and impossibly bright frescoes. The sea is close, salty and insistent, and somewhere below you, waves crash against the cliffs. You've arrived in Minoan Crete, in the palace of Knossos, sometime around 1500 BCE. And this place? It's a labyrinth of desire and myth, where sacred animals roam, goddesses rule, and the line between celebration and ritual is just a flick of the hip away. Knossos is like no palace you've seen before. There are no straight lines. The corridors spiral, the rooms shift in size, and just when you think you've figured out where you're going, a painted dolphin smiles at you from a ceiling, and you realise you're lost again. But that's kind of the point. The labyrinth isn't just architectural, it's psychological. It leads you inward, down and around and through until you've shed whatever version of yourself you arrived with. You're greeted by a priestess, or maybe she's a dancer, or maybe both. Her dress hugs her hips and flares at the hem, and her chest is bare in the Minoan fashion. Not scandalous, just factual. She smiles without words and beckons you through a corridor where the walls are painted with images of bulls, spirals, snakes, and women with arms raised high. You're here not to observe, but to enter, to participate, to be pulled, if you dare, into the labyrinth of lust. Now let's pause for a historical anchor. Minoan civilization was one of the earliest advanced cultures in Europe, known for its maritime trade, complex architecture, and rich religious life. While much of what we know is pieced together from ruins and the undeciphered linear A script, one thing is clear: the feminine divine reigned supreme. Goddesses dominate the art, priestesses led the rituals, and bulls, serpents, and fertility symbols appear so often, it's like someone was playing a very long, very sensual game of divine charades. You're led into a circular chamber at the heart of the palace. The floor is polished stone, the ceiling open to the sky. At its centre is a platform ringed with fire bowls and woven mats. Around it, other initiates, young, painted, poised, wait. The ritual is about to begin, and your pulse kicks just a little harder. This isn't a reenactment. It's something older, wilder. You hear the drums first, then the pipes. The music is unfamiliar but oddly intuitive, like your body knows the steps before your brain does. Procession begins. Dancers in swirling skirts and bull masks moving in perfect spiralling patterns. The priestess returns, this time with a snake in each hand, their bodies draped over her arms like living jewellery. She moves with them, hips circling, breasts rising with breath, and the others follow, mimicking her flow, turning movement into meditation. This is no modern strip show. This is sacred embodiment. Every sway of the hips, every flick of the wrist is a symbol, a spell, a call to the divine. And then the bull enters. No, not a literal one, though those did appear in other rituals, but a masked initiate, adorned in gold and crimson, his steps slow and deliberate. He meets the priestess at the centre of the circle, and they begin a ritualized dance, circling one another like planets caught in each other's gravity. It's not aggressive, it's not romantic, it's ritualized polarity, a play of masculine and feminine forces performed before an audience that is not merely watching but channeling. And here's your fringe fact. Some fringe scholars speculate that certain Minoan fertility rites involve the symbolic, or possibly literal union of priest and priestess, reenacting the marriage of earth and sky, bull and goddess. The idea isn't far-fetched. Similar rites existed throughout the ancient Near East, and Minoan art, with its focus on flowing movement, animals, and ecstatic poses, suggests a culture deeply comfortable with the sacred body. Sensuality wasn't separate from spirituality, it was one of its primary languages. The scholarly debate here is juicy and ongoing. Were these rituals truly sexual, or just deeply symbolic performance art? Without written records in a readable language, scholars are left with frescoes, figurines, and speculation. Some argue that the lack of explicitly erotic depictions suggests the sensuality was metaphorical. Others point to the prominence of exposed female bodies, erotic poses, and phallic imagery and say, what part of this screams metaphor to you? You're leaning toward the latter. As the dance reaches its crescendo, the masked bull and snake-wielding priestess raise their hands and bow toward one another. The music slows, and for a moment, the room holds its breath. Then the dancers erupt again, laughter breaking out like rainfall, and the energy shifts from sacred tension to communal joy. You're handed a goblet of sweet wine, honeyed, spiced, almost dizzying, and pulled into the dance. You're not performing. You're not being watched. You're becoming. The movement is trance-inducing, not because of what it looks like, but because of what it does to you. You forget your name, your age, your timeline. There is only rhythm and breath and the ache in your thighs. Someone catches your hand, spins you, presses their palm against your chest just long enough to remind you that you are alive, and then they're gone again in the crowd. When the dance ends, you collapse against the smooth, warm stone, chest heaving, heart wide open. Overhead, the stars have gathered, curious and quiet. You've passed through the labyrinth, not to find a monster, but to release one, and you feel lighter for it. You're told nothing. There is no closing ceremony, just the silent departure of bodies into shadowed corridors, the slow return of normalcy. But something's different now. Your body is different. It remembers, not the steps or the songs, but the permission. The permission to move, to feel, to offer your desire like incense to the sky. You leave Knossos with wine on your breath and fire in your spine. The goddess doesn't follow. She doesn't have to. She's already inside you. By now, you've stopped expecting transitions. One moment you're breathing in the sea-soaked air of Minoan ecstasy, and the next, the air sharpens, the sky darkens, the stone underfoot feels less like sacred architecture and more like something thrown together in a rush. Because it was. You're in ancient Rome, sometime around 186 BCE, and if there's one thing you need to understand about where you've landed, it's this. You're not supposed to be here. Because the ritual you're about to witness, it's been banned, hunted, buried, and yet tonight it lives on, in secret, behind locked doors and coded words. Welcome to the Bacchanalia. You hear it before you see it. The thrum of drums muffled by stone walls, the distant too happy laughter of people who've had more than a few goblets of wine, and something else beneath it, a pulse, not of music, but of anticipation. You press yourself through a narrow passageway beneath a villa on the Aventine Hill. The door was unmarked. The password was whispered. The torches flicker unnaturally, casting shadows that seem to dance before the dancers do. And when you enter the chamber, the first thing that hits you is the heat, followed closely by the scent of wine, sweat, and something animal. This isn't Rome at its polished imperial best. This is Rome in its hidden fever. The cult of Bacchus, or Dionysus if you want the Greek version, began innocently enough. He was the god of wine, after all, of theatre, ritual madness, and divine intoxication. A little fun, a little philosophy, but Rome is always suspicious of fun that isn't state-approved. Especially when women are involved. Especially when secrets are kept. Tonight, the worshippers, dozens of them, are masked and robed, their identities protected by darkness and anonymity. Men and women intermingle freely, a scandal in itself. In the Republic, this isn't just unorthodox, It's terrifying to those in power, because here, pleasure isn't controlled, it's embraced, and that kind of liberation is dangerous. The ceremony begins with a procession. Not military, not orderly. This one slinks and spirals. A woman in a lion's pelt leads, carrying a thyrsus, Bacchus's sacred staff tipped with ivy and pine cone. Around her, followers call out praises, some in Latin, some in Greek, some in languages you don't recognize. The atmosphere is part orgy, part opera, part protest. Everyone knows this is forbidden. That's what makes it sacred. Let's get grounded. The historical bacchanalia was originally a Greek import, part of Rome's larger habit of absorbing the gods of conquered peoples. At first, the rites were small, women-only gatherings, but over time the rituals expanded, too quickly and too freely for Roman comfort. By the time the Senate noticed, these gatherings had morphed into all-night affairs filled with ecstatic dancing, wine-fueled visions, and yes, likely sexual rites. The state response? A full-blown panic. In 186 BCE, a Senate decree, Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, outlawed the bacchanalia across Italy. Temples were demolished, priests imprisoned or executed. Participation without approval became a capital offence, and yet, as you can clearly see tonight, people didn't stop. They just got quieter. The pleasure became subversive. Fringe fact, some reports claim that during these secret ceremonies initiates would drink a sacramental wine believed to contain hallucinogenic herbs, possibly nightshade or mandrake. Whether these reports were fact or the fever dreams of Roman moralists isn't clear, but the result? Participants claimed to see gods, to become gods, to shed identity entirely and merge into collective ecstasy. And from a distance, that kind of spiritual shedding can look an awful lot like political rebellion. You sit near the edge of the chamber as the rites intensify. Robes slip off shoulders, lips find skin. But what strikes you isn't the sexuality, it's the freedom. No one is being watched, no one is being judged. Here, desire isn't controlled or monetized or measured against state interest. It's allowed to be. Raw, unapologetic, joyous. And that, more than any erotic act, is what makes this a threat. The scholarly debate here is a juicy one. Were the Bacchanalia truly erotic cults, or just victims of Roman propaganda? Some argue the Senate's descriptions of the rites, wild sex, drunken orgies, even rumours of human sacrifice were exaggerations, meant to justify a crackdown on non-traditional religious practices and limit female autonomy. After all, the cult was one of the few places in Roman society where women could act outside their prescribed domestic roles. Others argue that the rituals were intense, intentionally so, designed to push boundaries and invoke divine madness. Not scandal for scandal's sake, but as a spiritual necessity. You're beginning to see both sides. Because whether these rites were a carefully constructed rebellion or a genuine spiritual practice, their power came from the same place, pleasure without apology. A man passes you a goblet, eyes glassy with wine and something else. Devotion, maybe. You drink, the taste is bitter and sweet and full of smoke. Your limbs relax, the room feels alive. Around you, the dance becomes less about movement and more about dissolution. You're not watching bodies. You're watching boundaries fall away. Between people, between gods and mortals, between control and chaos. A woman takes your hand, she doesn't speak, she doesn't need to. You're pulled gently into the center, where the air crackles with intention. No one tells you what to do, that's the point. You move as you are moved, and in that moment, sweaty, anonymous, surrounded by strangers who feel like mirrors, you understand why this ritual terrified the Senate more than any army ever could. Because here, you're not a Roman citizen. You're not a cog in the Republic's machine. You're a vessel for ecstatic divinity. And that, to a state obsessed with control, is the ultimate sedition. Eventually, the music slows. The masks are removed. Some people cry, others laugh. You're not quite sure what you feel, except free. Really, terrifyingly free. As you leave through the hidden passage, someone presses a sprig of ivy into your hand. A symbol, a memory, a warning. The Bacchanalia may be outlawed, but its spirit cannot be legislated. And long after the Romans fall, long after their stone crumbles and their law books turn to dust, the memory of this night will live on, in whisper, in rumour, in bodies that remember what it means to become the god instead of just worshipping one. The ivy stem is still clutched in your hand as you drift away from the smoky depths of Rome's forbidden chambers. You don't remember walking, you don't remember sleeping, you simply wake to the smell of sea air, lemon trees, and warm, sun-washed stone. The air here is softer, the light gentler. You're no longer in a city obsessed with order and conquest. You're on the island of Lesbos, sometime around the 6th century BCE, where lyric poetry slips between women like secret smoke and the divine hides in the curve of a wrist. This place is not a temple in the traditional sense. There are no golden statues or sacrificial fires, but make no mistake, you are inside a sanctuary. One where Sappho herself still whispers from the stones. You walk narrow paths through olive groves and tangled vineyards, following laughter and music toward a low private dwelling at the edge of a cliff. There's no grand entryway, no priests, no altars, just a woven curtain and the scent of sweet resin wafting from within. You pass through the threshold and step into a room filled with cushions, woven mats, and the slow drip of honey from a bowl left lazily on the floor. And women reclining, reading, composing, their robes slip off their shoulders with casual grace, not as performance, but as comfort. There is no shame here, only presence, only song. This is Sappho's Theaisos, her intimate circle of students, lovers, and devotees. It's been romanticized, argued over, sanitized, and scandalized, but the truth is more nuanced than any modern projection can grasp. It was a space of education and worship, yes, but also of affection, sensuality, and poetry that burned like low flames in the dark. Here's your historical fact to sip slowly. Sappho of Lesbos was one of the greatest lyric poets of the ancient world. Though only fragments of her work survive, what remains has captivated generations with its raw emotional power and erotic intimacy. She wrote about love between women not as metaphor or myth, but as lived experience, desire so potent it made the gods pause. Her work wasn't marginal. She was honoured alongside Homer. Her songs were sung at festivals. Her voice was considered holy. You sit beside one of the women, a young initiate with ink-stained fingers and sleepy eyes. She offers you a fig without speaking. Someone begins to read, slow, deliberate, like a prayer. The words aren't stiff or stylized. They're aching, tender. I want, she reads, to say something, but shame prevents me. Yet, if you had a desire for good and beautiful things, this would not have seemed so painful to you. The room stills, the air thickens. You realize in this moment you're hearing sacred longing, not the orchestrated ecstasy of a state-sponsored ritual, but the quiet, thunderous ache of human connection elevated to divine art. Fringe fact time, there's a theory, admittedly niche, but fiercely defended by some, that Sappho's gatherings included erotic initiation rites, drawing from older fertility cult traditions. Some scholars point to references of ceremonial garlands, oil anointing, and metaphoric marriages between older and younger women. Others dismiss these as poetic flourishes. The truth? Hard to say, but in a culture where gods regularly slept with mortals and desire was seen as a sign of divine favour, the line between metaphor and ritual was blissfully blurry. You look around and realise something else. This is a temple, just not one marked by marble columns. Here, the act of composing verse, of touching a friend's shoulder, of braiding another's hair while humming a hymn to Aphrodite, that's the ritual. Here, intimacy is sacred not in its performance but in its permission. A glance can be a prayer, a kiss an offering, a poem a shared sacrifice of vulnerability. And now the scholarly debate simmering under every mention of Sappho's name. Was her community truly erotic in nature, or have modern minds projected sexuality onto what was simply emotional closeness? Some argue that ancient Greek expressions of same-sex affection were more fluid, more poetic, and not necessarily sexual. Others point to the intensity of Sappho's verses and say, "Come on, have you read this?" And yes, you have. And no, it doesn't feel hypothetical. It feels personal, embodied, sacred. You're handed a lyre. No one asks if you play, you're just expected to try. And somehow your fingers find their way plucking a hesitant rhythm. A woman across the room smiles and joins in, her voice steady, her tone low and teasing. The others pick up the melody, and soon the chamber becomes a tide of sound and breath, not loud, not polished, just real. As the music fades, another fragment is read, one of Sappho's best-known lines. Eros shakes my soul like wind on the mountain falling on oak trees. You feel that. The way desire doesn't ask for permission, the way it doesn't perform. It arrives, it disrupts, it roots itself in your chest and demands to be worshipped. Later, you walk the cliffs in silence with one of the initiates. No words pass between you. But her hand brushes yours and doesn't move away. You watch the moon rise over the Aegean. You hear waves breaking below like a heartbeat slowed by affection. And in that moment, you understand that what happened back in the Bacchanalia was explosion. But here, it's immersion. You part ways at dawn, no promises made, no grand declarations, just a shared understanding that something passed between you, something offered and received, without need for ritual incense or sacred oaths, just a night of words and warmth and presence. As you descend the cliff path, your bare feet brushing through thyme and seagrass, you feel more awake than you've felt in any temple so far. This wasn't performance, this was the holy made wholly human. And Sappho? She knew it all along. You glance back once, but their house is gone. Or maybe it was never really there to begin with. Maybe that's how sacred places work. They open only when you're ready. And then, like the best kind of lovers, they leave you changed without ever claiming you. The cliffs of Lesbos dissolve into sea mist behind you, and you drift again. Not forward, but deeper. You don't travel so much as get pulled, like silk sliding through a ring, into the echo of something half forgotten, half whispered through incense smoke and candlelight. You land in India, but not the one of epic battles or gilded palaces. You're in a smaller, more secret corner of the subcontinent, perhaps the 4th or 5th century CE, in the courtyard of a weathered temple tucked among banyan trees. The carvings are fading, but still legible. You run your hand along the stone and realize you're not looking at gods in cosmic poses. You're looking at positions. Legs, arms, backs arched, hands clasped. This temple was built with one book in mind, the Kama Sutra. Now take a deep breath, because what you think you know about this text is probably wrong. Yes, the Kama Sutra contains erotic positions. Yes, some of them are logistically ambitious. But the book is so much more than a guide to acrobatics for the intimately adventurous. You're not here for cheap titillation. You're here for what the original writers intended. A manual for the art of living. A spiritual treatise. Disguised as a pleasure guide. And if you know where to look, a map of temple ritual lost beneath centuries of prudish translation. The author of the Kama Sutra, one Vatsyayana, likely never expected his work to be reduced to a novelty gift at bachelor parties. His text was part of a larger philosophical tradition, known as the Purusharthas, the 4 goals of life, Dharma, duty, Artha, wealth, Moksha, liberation, and Karma, pleasure. And here's the twist. All 4 were considered equally important. Pleasure wasn't the enemy of virtue, it was a pillar of human purpose. You sit cross-legged beside a carved stone platform where, perhaps centuries ago, lovers enacted rituals guided not just by physical craving but by spiritual choreography. In certain temples, particularly those influenced by tantric practices, the Kama Sutra's principles weren't just studied, they were performed. Every breath, every movement, every gaze held longer than polite society allows was a step in a ritual that blurred the line between the sacred and the sensual. Here's your historical pin to press into the map. While the Kama Sutra is most often remembered for its sexual content, only about 1/5 of the text actually deals with intercourse. The rest covers topics like courtship, grooming, conversation, seduction, marriage, infidelity, and yes, even how to stage dramatic performances. This wasn't just a sex guide, it was a life philosophy, wrapped in elegant Sanskrit and offered not to the masses, but to those with the education and leisure to explore its depths, the elite, the priestly, the initiated. Fringe fact incoming, some temple schools, now lost to time, were rumoured to use the Kama Sutra as a training manual for devadesis, female temple dancers who served both deity and devotee through movement, music, and in some cases sacred companionship. Not prostitutes, not wives, these women occupied a third space, honoured and feared, their roles both spiritual and sensual. The Kama Sutra wasn't just literature, it was part of their curriculum. You shift slightly on the stone floor, imagining the scene, a ritual chamber, heavy with the scent of sandalwood and camphor, oil lamps flickering against the carved walls, a priest and priestess, or perhaps lovers posing as divine avatars, beginning a maithuna, A ritual union meant not for entertainment, but for cosmic balance. The Kama Sutra described not just how to please a partner, but how to become absorbed in them, to lose the ego in the act of total surrender. And if done correctly, it wasn't just pleasure, it was transcendence. Here's the scholarly debate that still ruffles the linen of academia. Was the Kama Sutra a practical handbook or a ritual text? Some argue it was a secular guide for the urban elite, full of etiquette and eroticism but disconnected from any real temple tradition. Others insist it was used by spiritual schools to train initiates in the art of sacred union. After all, the language of the Kama Sutra is steeped in metaphor. Fire, lotus, breath, sound, rhythm. It reads like scripture dressed in silk. You wander through the temple ruins now, fingertips brushing the carvings. You pass a frieze of two lovers mid-embrace, their limbs entwined, not just in desire, but in balance, neither dominating, neither yielding. The caption, had there been one, might read, "Perfect alignment of the self and the other." Around them, a ring of musicians, a dancer, a scribe. It's a community scene, not a private bedroom. This wasn't shameful. This was a public prayer in the language of bodies. You enter a small chamber, the innermost sanctum. There's no deity here, just a low dais, and behind it a wall with carvings faded by time. But you recognize the shape. Two figures, back arched, fingers linked, eyes open. This wasn't about an anonymity. This was about being fully seen. And then it hits you. The Kama Sutra didn't survive because it was erotic. It survived because it was honest. It treated the body as a legitimate expression of the soul. It made pleasure not a sin, but a skill, something you practiced, honed, shared, worshipped. You sit for a moment in the silence of the ruined sanctum. The sun filters through the latticework, carving light into geometric patterns across the floor. You breathe, deeply, slowly. And for the first time in a while, your breath doesn't feel like yours. It feels shared. Because someone, 1,000 years ago, might have sat here too. Breath shaking, skin warm, saying nothing, doing everything. The modern world will tell you the Kama Sutra is a book about sex. But in this temple, you now understand it was a scripture of presence, a reminder that to touch with love, to gaze without fear, to move with the rhythm of desire, is to worship not just the body, but the divine that lives within it. The air around you thickens, not from smoke or scent, but from memory itself, cloying, slow, sticky with endings. You don't move so much as sink, as if the warmth of the Kama Sutra temple is being drained out from beneath you. And as it fades, you sense it. Something colder is coming, something sharper. The hum of breath and body gives way to silence, and then, snap. The world resets. Now you're standing at the edge of a fire. Not a ritual flame, not ceremonial. This one burns with purpose, with control, with fear. You're no longer in the age of sacred union. You're somewhere in late antiquity, somewhere between the 4th and 6th centuries CE. The names of the old gods still cling to crumbling temples, but their rituals are no longer welcome. What you're witnessing isn't a ceremony. It's a purge. Scrolls of philosophy, poetry, and prayer go up in smoke, tossed by hands that claim to be cleaning house for purity's sake. Statues are pulled down, reliefs are chiseled blank. But what really breaks your heart is this: the silence of the devotees, the ones who once danced and offered and sang, now watching with hollow eyes as the stories of their gods are erased. You're witnessing the rise of censorship, and with it, the beginning of a long, anxious age, where pleasure becomes suspicion, and sacred desire is rewritten as dangerous temptation. The lush tapestry of sensual spirituality, woven over thousands of years, is now being unravelled deliberately. It starts slow, a law here, a tax there. Suddenly temples to love goddesses must register with the state. Then comes the language. Impure, immoral, heathen. The words take root like thorns. In Rome, in Byzantium, in every place touched by the growing shadow of orthodoxy, sacred pleasure is no longer just frowned upon, it's targeted, and soon what was once divine becomes criminal. Let's be clear. This isn't about one religion toppling another. This is about a cultural shift, a deep, deliberate move away from the idea that pleasure could ever be sacred. It wasn't just the temples that fell, it was the mindset. that lush, complex belief that bodies could be holy, that intimacy could be an offering. It didn't vanish overnight, but it began to rot from within. You move through cities that once thrived on the harmony of body and soul. Corinth, Ephesus, Alexandria. You walk the now quiet streets of temples where Aphrodite, Inanna, Isis and Hathor were once worshipped with laughter and dance. In some places their statues remain, buried in rubble, their faces chipped away by hammers. Others are buried more gently, covered in cloth and lowered into hidden vaults by heartbroken priestesses, hoping the future might someday be kinder. Here's your historical anchor. By the end of the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire had begun to actively suppress pagan practices. The Theodosian decrees banned sacrifices, closed temples, and outlawed the old rites. And what was considered pagan was often sensual, embodied, female-led. Devadesses were rebranded as prostitutes. Temple priestesses became witches. Sacred dances were condemned as lewdness. Ritual baths were seen as perversions. And the old gods? They became devils in disguise. Your fringe fact tonight is a chilling one. Some early Christian bishops believed that demons entered the world through orgasm, that ecstasy opened the gates to dark spirits. One bishop even argued that women should avoid sex entirely unless for procreation, lest they invite lustful spirits to nest in their wombs. Romantic, right? Suddenly, every trace of pleasure once woven into divine practice became a gateway to corruption. But not everyone agreed. Even within these growing religious structures, there were whispers, margins of manuscripts filled with poetry just a little too warm, mystics who described a divine union in terms that were suspiciously sensual, saints who dreamed of their gods embracing them in the night. The fire didn't kill everything, it just drove it underground, and so you walk past hidden rooms beneath churches, where the tiles still bear images of Venus in her glory. You press your palm to walls once soaked in oil and breath. You catch fragments of a chant in a language too old to trace, still echoing through time because someone refused to forget. The debate among historians is fierce. Did censorship truly destroy these traditions, or just drive them into secrecy, where they evolved into something even more powerful? Some scholars argue that these rituals were snuffed out by institutional power, their last embers fading by the early Middle Ages. Others point to the survival of mystery cults, alchemical sex rites and tantric texts as evidence that sacred pleasure never died. It adapted. You pause in a room once used for sacred union. The symbols are faint now, scratched out by centuries of disapproval. But they're still there. A lotus, a pair of clasped hands, a stylized flame. This was once a place of celebration, of surrender. Now it's just another ruin with no plaque, no tour guide. Only you know what it was, what it meant. As you leave, the sky shifts. It's darker now, the colours more subdued. The world is entering an era of rules, boundaries, and shame carefully polished into doctrine. The body is no longer trusted, the senses are no longer teachers, desire is no longer a prayer, it is a problem to be solved. But you carry something with you, a sliver of warmth from those earlier nights, the echo of song from a temple now silent, the memory of a touch that meant more than possession. And though the world around you may have changed, your body remembers, because what was sacred can never be fully destroyed, only hidden, only hushed, and always waiting for the right soul to find it again. The shadows lengthen now, thickening like ink spilled across the page. You've walked through eras of ecstatic celebration, of carved stone and fragrant smoke, of dances that summoned gods and love, that whispered through the rafters of temples. But here, now, you feel it settle, a sharp stillness, a closing in. The sacred body, once honoured in open-air ceremonies and sung to in erotic hymns, has been placed beneath a shroud, tightly, deliberately. You've entered the age when desire doesn't just raise suspicion, it raises accusation. Welcome to the dominion of early Christianity, where pleasure becomes sin, the body becomes a battlefield, and temple priestesses are rebranded as something else entirely. Heretics. You're walking through a city that looks familiar. Jerusalem, perhaps, or Rome again, but drained of colour. Its temples are either in ruins or repurposed. Its shrines to goddesses are now cold, echoing chapels, whitewashed and silent. Even the wind feels nervous. You pass a woman on the street, cloaked, her eyes lowered, and when you meet her gaze, there's a flicker of something, like recognition. She walks faster. She doesn't want to be seen with you, not here, not now. This is the era of transformation. Not of stone into spirit, but of reverence into fear. The sensuality that once pulsed through sacred rites is now recast as corruption. Where once there were altars adorned with offerings of honey and perfume, now there are pulpits from which chastity is preached as the highest virtue, and anything less is a direct affront to God, especially if it comes from a woman. Here's your anchor. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had gone from outlawed sect to state religion. And with that rise to power came a reckoning, not just with competing gods, but with embodied spirituality itself. The body, once seen as a vessel of divine connection, was now the seat of temptation. Flesh wasn't sacred anymore, it was dangerous. You pass by a once grand temple to Aphrodite, now converted into a basilica. The statues are gone, the mosaics have been plastered over, but in a forgotten side chapel, hidden behind a broken partition, you find it. A relief of a woman dancing, barely visible beneath layers of soot. Her hips still curve, her arms still rise, but she has been buried beneath sermons. And here comes your fringe fact. Some of the earliest Christian monastic communities believed that wet dreams were the work of demons, not metaphorically, literally. There were entire prayers written to protect male monks from nocturnal emissions, which were believed to leak out the soul. Some monastics even wore nail-studded belts or slept in chains to keep their bodies in check. Desire wasn't something to work with anymore, it was something to fight. In this world, temple priestesses became symbols of decay. Their stories were rewritten. Once beloved figures of devotion and power, they were reimagined as prostitutes, harlots, and whores, tools of Satan to seduce holy men away from the path of righteousness. The word sacred was ripped from their roles and replaced with shame. And the worst part? Many of their names, their rituals, their entire lives were erased with astonishing efficiency. The scholarly debate is still raging. Did Christianity actively suppress sensual temple traditions, or did these rites simply fade with time? Some argue that early Christians were more tolerant than later institutions would admit, that they adopted festivals and sacred days rather than abolishing them outright. Others point to the destruction of goddess temples, the rebranding of feminine deities as demons, hello Lilith, and the chilling silence around female-led erotic rites as proof that this was not an evolution, it was an erasure. You walk through a cloister now, cold stone beneath your feet, the scent of damp wool and candle wax in the air. A nun crosses the hallway ahead of you, her face serene but distant. You wonder what she dreams about, what her hands remember, what longing she must press down each day like an unwanted wrinkle in a pressed sheet. And still, not everything is lost. Even in this world of suppression, fragments survive. A few saints, mystics mostly, describe their connection to God in language that sounds suspiciously sensual. Teresa of Avila, centuries later, would describe an angel piercing her heart with a golden spear, so intensely that the soul is satisfied with God. She shudders, she weeps, she feels divine fire entering her very depths. And you have to wonder, is this what Inanna felt in her temples of moonlight and myrrh? Some say these saints were sublimating sexual energy into spiritual fervour. Others say they were engaging in embodied prayer, not so different from the rites you've already seen, just stripped of names, of colour, of the freedom to say what they were doing, but the body remembers. You pass through a marketplace now, filled with the sounds of ordinary life. Merchants hawking figs, children running barefoot, women trading gossip in lowered tones. And in the corner, a group of elders muttering about a woman who lives alone near the edge of town. They say she burns strange herbs, that men come to her in the night, that she speaks of stars and serpents and the softness of silk. You know that story. She used to be a priestess. Now she's a witch. The world has tilted. Sacred has become sinful. And yet somehow it all still hums beneath the surface. A soft, forbidden rhythm pulsing like a drum you're not supposed to hear. Because even as the temples fall and the statues crack and the old chants are outlawed, the truth remains, desire cannot be destroyed. It only waits, hiding in poetry, in lullabies, in dreams. It flows like water into new vessels, changes shape, adapts, survives. And so do those who carry it. You leave the town under the cloak of dusk, the air cooler now, the sky a bruised purple. The road ahead winds into darkness, but you walk without fear, because even if the sacred body has been buried under centuries of guilt and dogma, it's still there, warm and waiting. And somewhere out there, beyond the silence, someone is still singing to it. The road darkens as you walk, not in the way that night falls gently, but like a veil being pulled over the eyes. Deliberate, suffocating, strategic. You're not just moving forward in time now, you're descending. Past the burned temples and whitewashed sanctuaries, past the public silence and whispered prayers, into the underground, where the sacred body went to survive, and somehow, impossibly, it did survive. Welcome to the secret halls of those who refuse to forget, the keepers of flame, the ones who practiced their rites in basements, brothels, forests, and hidden rooms carved into stone. Tonight you're stepping into the underground survival of sensual rites. The city above doesn't know what's happening beneath its feet, or maybe it pretends not to. The buildings are respectable now, monasteries, courts, churches, homes. But underneath, in the cellars and catacombs and bricked-over chapels, a different kind of worship unfolds. No statues, no carved instructions, just memory. Muscle memory, mostly, passed from hand to hand, breath to breath. This is a world built on whispers, on coded gestures, on the belief that pleasure isn't just resistance, it's remembrance. The chamber you enter is candlelit, circular, intimate. Not opulent, functional. There are no gold altars here, just a cloth-covered platform, bowls of oil, and a quiet hum of human presence. The people here don't look like rebels. They look like anyone else. But their eyes carry the weight of something ancient, something dangerous. You've stumbled into a gathering that calls itself nothing. No name, no doctrine, just a continuation of what once was. Let's set the historical stage. In the late medieval period, especially during the height of the Inquisition, sensual rites were hunted down with obsessive fervour. But not everyone burned. Some adapted. Across Europe and parts of the Near East, syncretic groups, those blending old pagan practices with thin veils of Christianity or Islam, began to form. Some were overtly heretical. Others weren't even considered religious at all. They were midwives, healers, dancers, musicians. Their rituals didn't survive in books. They survived in bodies. Fringe fact, in parts of France and Italy, groups of women, sometimes called femmes, sages, wise women, sometimes simply the old ones, performed what they claimed were blessing rituals for fertility and love, often involving touch, massage, bathing, and sometimes, yes, sexual release. They claimed their lineage traced back to the temples of Isis. The church claimed they were witches. The women, for the most part, didn't care what anyone thought. Tonight, in this chamber, you see a version of that. A rite for healing. A woman lies at the centre, breathing slowly, surrounded by others murmuring words you don't recognise. Her eyes are closed. Her body is bare but not exposed. Oiled hands move slowly along her limbs, not for arousal but for awakening. The ritual is gentle, rhythmic and quiet. Not dramatic, not performative. It's like watching a lullaby unfold on skin. You've seen sacred sex before in temples carved from red stone and forests heavy with moonlight. But this feels more like a rescue mission. Every touch, every chant is pulling something out of the dark. Not just from the woman, but from the past itself. The scholarly debate around these underground rites is, of course, contentious. Did any of this really happen? Or are we romanticizing fragments and filling the gaps with modern desire? Some academics argue that there's little real evidence for organized secret erotic rituals in medieval Europe, at least none that survived official records. Others point to court transcripts, heresy trials, and folk stories passed down through oral tradition that seem to echo the structure of older temple rites. And then there are the artifacts, carved figurines found buried in gardens, smooth stones shaped like phalluses, or yoni, silk-wrapped bundles of herbs hidden in walls. They weren't souvenirs, they were tools, charms, symbols of a belief that the divine still lived in pleasure, even if that belief had to hide under the bed. You're handed a small bowl of oil, warm and scented with lavender and something earthier, clove, maybe. One of the attendants looks at you, not with instruction, but with invitation. You move slowly to another initiate, placing your hands on their shoulders, not sexual, not even overtly spiritual, just present. And it's enough. Your hands remember something older than shame. because that's the thing about touch. It carries echoes. It says, without words, I see for you, Paul. You're real. You're worthy. And in a world trying so hard to forget that, it's no wonder this kind of ritual had to go underground. As the rite ends, the woman at the centre begins to cry, not from pain but from relief. The room doesn't hush her, doesn't try to contain her emotion. They just sit with it, let it rise and pass like smoke, and then, slowly, they begin to sing. The song isn't loud, it's not a hymn. It sounds like a lullaby, but older. Maybe Sumerian, maybe not a language at all. Just sounds layered with memory. You feel it in your chest, like someone knocking softly on a door that hasn't opened in centuries. And suddenly you understand this isn't rebellion. It's devotion, preserved in muscle and murmur. These people aren't radicals, they're caretakers of a flame everyone else thought was extinguished. But down here, beneath the marble churches and stone doctrines, it still burns. Quietly, steadily. As you rise to leave, someone presses a coin into your hand. It's old, worn, maybe Greek, maybe something else entirely. The figure on it is faded, but clearly female. Her hair is wild. Her breasts are bare. She is smiling. You don't ask why they gave it to you. You just hold it close. When you climb back to the street, the world seems louder, sharper. But you carry a piece of that silence with you now. That room, that rite, that reminder that sacred pleasure never truly dies. It just goes into hiding, waiting for hands that remember how to hold it. The air changes again, cooler now, thinner, almost metallic in your lungs. You're no longer in the secret cellars of survival. You're standing in a candlelit chamber lined with thick books, curious instruments, and glass jars filled with substances you don't recognize. The furniture is heavy, the walls panelled in wood darkened by centuries of spoken secrecy. This isn't a temple in the traditional sense, and no one here wears robes or chants to forgotten gods, but the energy is unmistakably severed. You've stepped into the private world of alchemists, where the line between science, magic, and sensuality isn't just blurred, it's the entire point. Tonight, you're exploring the strange and shadowy realm where pleasure, alchemy, and the occult entwine like vines around a forbidden book. Your host for the evening greets you without formality. He wears a tunic streaked with ash and something purple. His fingers are stained with ink and mercury. He says nothing at first, only gestures toward a table where parchment diagrams spill across the surface, spirals, sigils, and anatomical drawings that look more erotic than medical. A figure of a man and a woman, each overlaid with celestial symbols, stands at the center of the chaos. You don't need translation. The message is clear. Union creates transformation. And that's the core of what these alchemists believed. The great work, magnum opus, wasn't just about turning lead into gold, it was about turning flesh into spirit, pleasure into power, sex into sacred transmutation. You're not here to watch people roll around on velvet cushions. You're here to see how the ancient ritual of union evolved into a coded language of symbolic fusion, one that informed not just underground mysticism, but later scientific revolution. Here's your historical touchstone. In Renaissance Europe, especially between the 15th and 17th centuries, alchemy wasn't considered nonsense. It was cutting edge, an experimental science built on ancient philosophies and mystical traditions, and at the heart of many of its treatises, behind the veils of Latin and metaphor, were elaborate allegories of erotic synthesis. The sun and the moon, sulphur and mercury, king and queen, masculine and feminine not at war, but in ecstatic dance. You leaf through one of the texts, an old alchemical grimoire with yellowed pages and impossible illustrations. In one, a man and woman are shown in embrace, their bodies half dissolved into fire and water. Above them, a serpent encircles the scene, its tail in its mouth. The caption reads, Solve et coagula. You dissolve and rejoin. Destroy the self to find the divine. It sounds suspiciously familiar. Fringe fact. Some alchemists, including the infamous Paracelsus, believed that sexual fluids contained potent spiritual energy. The quintessence, as they called it, was thought to be present in the union of lovers and could, when properly harnessed, unlock mystical insight or even prolong life. Yes, sex magic, long before the term existed. But here, it wasn't about indulgence. It was ritualized, controlled, exacting, a careful blending of breath, intention, and desire. You move into a side chamber lit by a soft, unnatural blue glow. Crystals pulse gently in shallow basins of water. 2 initiates sit opposite one another, palms pressed together, eyes closed, breathing in perfect unison. This isn't a seduction. It's a fusion experiment. The room is heavy with intention, and as you watch you feel a pull, not of attraction, but of mirroring. The kind of magnetic recognition that comes when 2 people drop every mask and meet soul to soul. That, according to the alchemists, is where real transformation happens. And now the debate, one that makes both historians and scientists twitch. Did Renaissance alchemists practice literal sexual rites, or was it all metaphor? Some argue the erotic imagery found in alchemical manuscripts was symbolic, representing the union of opposing forces, nothing more. Others say, have you seen these drawings? And point to the coded instructions, the recipes involving bodily fluids, the secrecy that echoes the mystery cults of the ancient world. There's even a theory that some alchemists were secretly preserving tantric techniques, filtered through centuries of translation and religious paranoia. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle. The language of the body, especially desire, was a tool, a mirror reflecting truths too volatile to name outright. And alchemy, it was about becoming something new, not by denying the flesh, but by passing through it. Your host returns and offers you a glass vial. It holds a golden liquid, thick and glowing. Elixir, he says with a smirk, or very old honey. Either way, it changes something. You drink. It tastes like sunlight and iron and something you can't quite place, memory maybe. Then he shows you the last room. It's circular, like so many sacred spaces before it, but lined with mirrors. At the centre, a simple bed, covered in deep blue silk. This is not for sleep. This is where 2 initiates, having studied the text and trained their breath, would enact the final rite, the conjunctio, the sacred joining. Not for pleasure alone, but to create something beyond, a state of being where boundaries dissolve. The self softens, and what remains is a kind of alchemical awakening. The walls reflect you in infinite versions, you watching, you remembering, you becoming. You step back dizzy with the weight of it all. This isn't ancient temple worship, it's not even open rebellion. It's something quieter, and in a way more dangerous. A philosophy that dares to say, yes, pleasure is sacred, but more than that, it's transformative. You leave the alchemist's lair under a sliver moon, the vial still warm in your hand. The world outside feels sharper now, brighter, not because it's changed, but because you have. The great work, after all, isn't just metaphor, it's you. Flesh, fire, shadow and spirit, all learning how to hold each other again. The road shifts beneath your feet, not in space but in altitude, ascending slowly, steadily into thinner air. Trees grow taller, more solemn. The scent of pine gives way to juniper and juniper to wind. You are high, dangerously so. And in this rarefied realm the rules change again. Gone are the stone altars, the mirrored chambers, the wine-slicked floors of underground rites. Here, the sacred is stripped to its bones, wrapped in red robes and woven mantras. You've arrived in the remote cloisters of medieval Tibet, where the wind chants through mountain passes and the most forbidden rituals of all are not hidden beneath floors, they are locked inside your own body. Welcome to the Tantric meditation cells, the secret inner sanctums of the Red Hat schools, where monks and dakinis pursue sacred union not as rebellion, but as enlightenment. The first thing you notice is the quiet. It isn't the absence of sound, but a quality of silence that feels inhabited, like the walls themselves are holding their breath. You're led through narrow corridors, past prayer wheels and flickering yak butter lamps until you reach a small stone cell, barely large enough for 2. A red curtain marks the threshold. You hesitate, and your guide, a senior monk, weathered, but with eyes as sharp as frost, nods once. No words. You step inside. The room smells of incense and wool. A low platform sits at the centre, covered in thick blankets. No icons, no symbols, just space. And yet the air hums with focus, with discipline, with something old and coiled. This is a salon chamber, a training ground for the advanced practices of Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, where the body is not renounced, but refined. Where pleasure, if it comes at all, is not the goal, but the tool. Here's your historical foothold. Vajrayana, or Tantric Buddhism, flourished in Tibet from the 8th century onward, evolving into a system of practices both wildly esoteric and ruthlessly practical. Among these were the completion stage yogas, involving subtle body channels, inner winds, and sexual energy, not to be repressed, but to be transmuted into awakening. Unlike earlier temple-based rites, these weren't public. They were passed secretly from teacher to student, practiced in isolation, and wrapped in coded language to prevent misuse. And yes, some of these advanced practices involved actual physical union between monk and consort called karma mudra, or action seal. But far more often, practitioners engaged in jhana mudra, the wisdom seal, where the consort was visualized, not embodied. The body, the breath, the mind became the temple, and the ritual? A voyage through internal realms where pleasure was not indulged, but weaponized against ignorance. The monk says nothing. He simply begins. His breath slows, becomes audible, deep, deliberate. He places his hands in a mudra, thumb and forefinger forming a circle. His spine straightens. You're not watching meditation, you're watching alchemy in motion, breath as bellows, mantra as fire. Inner winds rising through imagined channels, unlocking the chakras not for decoration, but as gates to emptiness, to the raw, unfiltered nature of reality. It's not sensual in the usual sense, but it's profoundly embodied. Fringe fact, some tantric adepts trained their bodies to raise inner heat, a practice called tummo, using breath, visualization, and control of subtle energies. In advanced stages, practitioners could dry wet sheets wrapped around their naked bodies in freezing snow purely through this inner fire. But more than a party trick, tummo was part of a larger matrix of yogas meant to redirect sexual energy inward, to dissolve duality and arrive at non-dual bliss, the union of male and female principles within a single, luminous awareness. You shift slightly, feeling the weight of the air. It's thick with concentration, and then, quietly, another figure enters the chamber, a woman also robed in red. Her face is calm, her presence changes nothing and everything. She sits opposite the monk, mirrors his posture, his breath, his gaze. They do not touch, but the space between them crackles. This is not intimacy as you know it. There's no flirtation, no romance. This is discipline dressed as devotion. A high-risk, high-stakes practice where even a flicker of distraction can unravel the whole ritual. They are not here to enjoy each other, they are here to dissolve the concept of each other entirely. And now, the great scholarly rift. Did tantric monks really engage in sexual union, or is it all metaphor? The academic world remains split. Some argue that karma mudra was extremely rare, if not purely symbolic, used only by advanced adepts with direct guidance. Others point to biographical records of great yogis like Milarepa and Tilopa, who describe union with dakinis in mystical terms that defy literal interpretation, but hint strongly at embodied ritual. The dakinis themselves, both historical and mythological, are fascinating. Wild, powerful, often nude, or semi-nude, they represent not just consorts, but the active wisdom force. They don't serve the male practitioner. They challenge him, cut through illusion. In some lineages, the dakini was seen as more advanced than her male counterpart, a catalyst for his transformation. It was never about dominance, always about balance. You watch as the two practitioners breathe in perfect sync. Their eyes remain open, fixed on each other, not with desire but with clarity. Time stretches. There's no climax, only dissolution. The boundaries of self begin to soften. In the tantric view, the highest pleasure is the collapse of separation, the moment where awareness expands so completely that all duality, male, female, body-spirit, self-other, falls away. And that is the moment of enlightenment. No candles sputter, no thunder rolls. When they finally lower their hands and close their eyes, it's not with exhaustion, but with stillness. They've gone somewhere you can't follow, not yet, but something in you understands now. The path of sacred pleasure didn't disappear. It evolved. It became quieter, deeper, sharper. Not a rebellion, but a discipline so exacting it terrifies those who mistake sensuality for indulgence. Here, pleasure is not about what you receive, it's about what you release. You leave the cell in silence, your breath slower than when you arrived. The cold air bites at your face, but your body feels warm, not from the temperature, but from the presence still pulsing in your chest. That space where desire and discipline finally stopped fighting and started speaking the same language. At the cliff's edge, you pause. Below you, the world sprawls in all its noisy, chaotic glory. But up here, in this quiet temple of breath and bone, you've glimpsed something most never will. Pleasure not as escape, but as path. And once you've seen that, nothing is quite the same again. The wind from the mountain still clings to your skin as you descend, slow and reverent, like stepping back into gravity after floating in a higher realm. But now the air grows warm again, lush and sweet. You catch the scent first, earth, blossoms, firewood, and something else, something more playful. You blink once and find yourself standing at the edge of a trail lined with rice paper lanterns, the kind that bob gently in the night like stars on strings. Drums sound faintly in the distance. The trail winds through a quiet village, then opens into a clearing where laughter echoes and joy isn't just permitted, it's celebrated. Welcome to Japan's Shinto fertility temples, where sacred doesn't mean solemn and the body is still invited to the party. You've arrived just in time for a festival, Honen Matsuri to be exact. Held each year in honor of harvest, fertility and good fortune, it's famous, and let's be honest, a little infamous, for one feature. The giant wooden phallus paraded through the streets like a rock star. But as you step into the crowd, brightly dressed, cheeks flushed with sak, you realize quickly that this is not satire. It's not obscene, it's unashamed, jubilant reverence for life, renewal, and the bodies that bring it forth. All around you, couples laugh and cheer, children eat pink mochi shaped like, well, you can guess, and elders wave branches of sakeki, the sacred tree of Shinto. The atmosphere is delightfully casual but layered with meaning. There's a shrine ahead, nestled under cedar trees, where the air shifts slightly. Bells ring, people bow. Even in this light-hearted celebration, the presence of the kami, the divine spirits, settles over the scene like silk. Here's your grounding fact. In Shinto, Japan's indigenous belief system, there is no concept of original sin, no cosmic guilt about the body. The kami are not judgmental gods, but nature spirits, embodiments of rivers, mountains, animals, and yes, even sex and reproduction. Fertility is not shameful, it's vital, and the temples honouring it are not hiding in shadows. They are central to the culture, woven into seasonal rituals and agricultural cycles. You make your way toward the shrine of Tagata Jinja, one of the most famous fertility sanctuaries in the country. The main ritual today involves carrying the mikoshi, a portable shrine, inside which is a 2.5-metre carved phallus, polished to a gleam, accompanied by chanting, singing, and a whole lot of hilarity. But it's not mockery. It's a kind of joyful permission to honour life without whispering. You pass a stall where women are tying wishes onto strings, small wooden plaques called ima, each bearing prayers for children, marriages, good crops, or better, performance. Some are serious, others humorously honest. You read one aloud. Please bless my husband so that we don't fall asleep before the fun part. The woman beside you chuckles and ties her own wish next to it. Fringe fact, there are dozens of Shinto shrines in Japan where genitalia are openly displayed, carved in stone or wood, worn as talismans, or even venerated through intimate rituals. One shrine, Kaneyama Jinja, is dedicated to a pair of deities who healed a woman's genital pain and now serve as protectors of sexual health and harmony. Couples visit to pray for pleasure. Not fertility, pleasure, out loud, with incense and everything. You approach the main altar where a priest in pristine white robes raises a sakaki branch in blessing. People bow, clap twice, and smile. Offerings are left, fruit, rice, bottles of sake, and yes, occasionally small wooden carvings of genitalia. The whole thing feels impossible by Western standards. Where else can you buy penis-shaped candy at a sacred shrine and still walk away feeling spiritually nourished? And this leads us into one of the more charming scholarly debates. Are Shinto fertility rituals truly sacred, or just cultural holdovers rebranded as spiritual practice? Some anthropologists argue that these rites have become more tourist-friendly than transcendent. Others insist that their resilience speaks to something profoundly rooted in Japanese culture, a worldview that doesn't split the sacred from the sensual. There's no need to rescue the body from itself, it was never exiled. You sit on a low bench beneath a cherry blossom tree, watching petals drift down like confetti. A young couple walks past holding hands, giggling at the sight of an elderly woman posing proudly beside the wooden phallus like it's the Eiffel Tower. No one stares, no one scolds, It's all just part of the rhythm of things: birth, growth, bloom, decay, return. Even the jokes carry reverence. Someone offers you a cup of warm amazake, fermented rice wine that smells like sweet milk and spring. You sip slowly and feel it loosen something inside you. Not just your muscles, for something older, that part of you taught to flinch at your own skin. To apologize for wanting. To seek God with your hands folded instead of outstretched. And you remember, this isn't the first place where sacred pleasure wore a smile. It's just one of the rare places where it never stopped. As the sun dips low, painting the sky in gold and rose, the procession begins. Drums thunder, shouts rise. The Mikoshi sways forward, carried by a small army of laughing men in festival coats. Confetti bursts, sake splashes, and all around you people cheer not because they're watching a spectacle, but because they're affirming life. No doctrine, no shame. Just joy carved into wood and dance through the streets. You bow once at the shrine before you leave. Not because you're required to, just because it feels right. The breeze carries a blossom past your face, and for a moment, it feels like a kiss from the divine. Because maybe that's the secret Shinto never forgot. To laugh is also to pray. And sometimes the holiest thing you can do is throw a festival for the very body that brought you here. The echoes of laughter fade behind you, carried away by the last of the festival breeze. You walk now through the scent of scorched earth, maize husks and blooming marigolds. The light changes, hardens. It's no longer warm and pink like a cherry blossom sunset. This sun is direct, unflinching and ancient. You're somewhere different now, somewhere far from subtle metaphors and playful celebrations. Here, the divine is fierce, blood-fed and dazzling. You're standing on the sacred grounds of the Aztecs, deep within the ritual heart of Tenochtitlan, and tonight, desire and death are not opposites. They are dance partners, locked in a cycle of bloom and sacrifice. Welcome to the realm of the flower wars of flesh. At first glance, it's all beauty. Petals scattered across white steps, incense rising in curling ribbons, dancers swaying in feathered costumes that catch the dying light like firebirds. The music is a throb of drums, heartbeat deep, steady, and insistent. But underneath this pageantry, there's a different kind of anticipation. This isn't just a celebration. It's a conjuration, a ceremony that entwines sensuality and blood, aesthetics and agony into one cosmic offering. And you're here to watch how ecstatic ritual shaped one of the most misunderstood empires in history. Let's pin the history first. The Aztecs, more accurately the Mexica, saw the universe as a fragile balance held together by human will and divine sacrifice. Every force, fertility, war, rain, corn, pleasure, had its god or goddess. And those gods? They weren't passive beings lounging in clouds. They were hungry, and the offerings they demanded weren't always metaphorical. But here's the twist. Pleasure was part of the offering too. In the rituals of Xochipilli, the god of flowers, beauty, art, dance, and sacred sexuality, worshippers engaged in elaborate ceremonies that involved both ecstatic music and possibly entheogenic substances. You walk into a temple cloaked in painted murals, flowers bursting open, bodies twined in motion, tongues extending in sacred speech or song. There's no shame here, no modesty. The body is not hidden. It is the canvas, the instrument, the sacrifice. Tonight's ritual centers around a flower war offering, a ceremonial conflict staged not for conquest, but for spiritual balance. The name might sound like contradiction, but to the Mexica, there was no contradiction at all. Beauty and brutality were not rivals, they were siblings. And the war? It wasn't fought just with weapons, it was fought with bodies, with desire, with ecstatic intensity offered up to gods who demanded vibrance, not politeness. Fringe fact, some Aztec rituals, particularly those honouring Tlazolteotl, goddess of filth, lust, purification and renewal, may have involved sexual confessionals, where participants would confess their carnal sins to a priest and then engage in ritual cleansing. Tlazolteotl wasn't there to punish desire. She existed to absorb and transform it, turning shame into purification. In some traditions, she even devoured the sins, literally, a goddess who swallowed transgression and spat out rebirth. Tonight, the energy in the plaza is high. You watch dancers clad in jaguar skins move in concentric circles, mimicking the hunt and the chase. Their movements are sensual, aggressive, mesmerizing. The crowd chants along, not words, but syllables that vibrate in your ribs. The initiates move forward, painted in reds and yellows. With flowers tucked behind their ears and lines of pigment streaked across their thighs, they represent the divine in bloom, offering themselves not just in blood but in presence. And yes, it's erotic, but not in a way that asks to be consumed. It's erotic in the sense that it's undeniably alive. Every gesture, every beat of the drum reminds you that life is a tightrope walk between beauty and oblivion. That to live fully is to live deliberately, to make yourself worthy of being seen by gods. Then comes the moment of stillness. A young initiate is led forward, draped in flowers, his chest bare, his eyes closed in anticipation, not fear. Around him the dancers fall to their knees, raising their arms to the sun now setting in a blaze of gold and crimson. A priest approaches, his costume more elaborate, his face painted like a skull in bloom. The crowd breathes as one, the blade flashes. You look away instinctively, but the silence tells you everything. This isn't spectacle, it's continuation, the ultimate offering not made in grim duty, but in ecstatic surrender. The initiate believed he was becoming divine in that moment, united with the god in a flash of pure intensity. The gods were not watching from afar. They were present, summoned through rhythm and breath and blood. Here's where scholars still argue fiercely. How much of Aztec sacrificial ritual was spiritual, and how much was political theatre? Some claim it was all about state control, fear tactics dressed in feathers. Others argue these rites were genuinely religious, born of a worldview so different from ours that it's almost impossible to translate. What looks like violence to us may have felt like the highest form of communion to them, and within that communion, desire and death were partners in a cosmic waltz. As the crowd begins to disperse, petals trampled underfoot, you notice something striking. There is no grief, no outrage, there is reverence, the same way a lover might look upon a partner after a shared moment of vulnerability. These people don't separate the sacred from the sensual, the beautiful from the brutal. They understand what modern minds often try to forget, that to touch the divine is to step close to the edge, and that edge is never clean. You follow the last of the crowd down a painted stone path lined with candles, still hearing the rhythm of the drums echoing inside your bones. You feel changed, not horrified, not thrilled, but awake. Your breath feels more precious, your skin more honest, and the next time you hear a drumbeat, wherever you are in the world, part of you will wonder, is this the sound of sacrifice or seduction, or both? The air ripples with heat as you step away from the flower-strewn stones of Tenochtitlan. For a moment it feels like you're walking through smoke, ritual smoke, incense smoke, the kind that leaves a flavour on your tongue and ghosts behind your eyes. Then it clears, and you're somewhere else entirely. No drums, no dancers, just the smell of oil lamps, wet clay and damp scrolls. The quiet here is ancient and dense, like the walls themselves are holding back stories too wild to be spoken aloud. Welcome to early Mesopotamia, where some of the oldest known rituals of sacred pleasure were born, not in hidden chambers, but in the very heart of the temple. You're standing at the entrance of a ziggurat in Uruk, the great Sumerian city that birthed writing myth and quite possibly the world's first erotic priestess. Inanna's Heimbevedant, known by many names, all half erased by time. The stone beneath your feet is worn from centuries of pilgrims. The walls whisper with the energy of ceremonies that took place millennia before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before shame wrapped itself around the human body like a second skin. This is Inanna's domain, goddess of love, war, fertility, and divine chaos. You may have met echoes of her before, in Aphrodite's smirk, in Ishtar's crown, in every temple where ecstasy refused to be tamed. But here, in the dust and heat of Mesopotamia, she is at her fiercest. Not just a goddess of desire, but its sios, its weapon, its sacrament. Here's your historical lens. In Sumerian temples, particularly those dedicated to Inanna, there existed a caste of sacred sex workers, known as Kadishtu, a word often mistranslated but carrying connotations closer to holy woman or consecrated priestess. They weren't prostitutes. They were ritual specialists, trained not only in the physical arts of love, but in song, poetry, dance, and spiritual connection. When someone entered the temple seeking union, they weren't seeking flesh alone, they were seeking divine embodiment. Fringe fact, some of these rites were so structured they followed seasonal liturgies. One of the most famous was the sacred marriage ritual, where the king of the land symbolically mated with the high priestess of Inanna, acting as the goddess herself to renew the fertility of the earth. This wasn't just state propaganda, it was a spiritual performance of cosmic balance, reenacted year after year in a space where ecstasy, power, and prayer were one and the same. You walk through the temple now, its columns fluted and massive, casting thick shadows across the floor. You pass murals of winged figures, animals entwined mid-embrace, and Inanna herself, standing naked but crowned, flanked by lions, holding what looks like a twisted rope in one hand and a ring in the other. These aren't symbols of subjugation, they were tools of command. Inanna didn't ask for permission, she demanded rapture, and it was given. You enter a smaller chamber, dimly lit by flickering oil lamps. The air is warmer here, almost humid. Cushions line the floor, scattered with dried rose petals and herbs. The walls are covered in cuneiform inscriptions, prayers to the goddess written in the oldest script known to humanity. You pick out one phrase repeated over and over: to enter her temple is to taste eternity. In the corner sits an older woman, hair braided, eyes sharp with the kind of wisdom that can't be taught, only passed down. She doesn't greet you with a smile, she just watches, measuring. You realise this is the priestess, a remnant, a vessel. She gestures to a low basin of water and bids you wash your hands. Then your face, then your chest. It's not about cleanliness, it's about preparation. Then she sings. The sound is low, vowel-rich, rising and falling like wind through reeds. It's not a song for you, it's a song for Inanna. A call, an invitation. And as it fills the room, something shifts. You're no longer just a visitor, you're a participant. The priestess begins a slow movement, almost a dance, fingers tracing old patterns in the air. Her steps echo rituals older than language, designed not to seduce, but to summon. And now the debate. Were these rituals truly sexual, or are modern interpretations projecting too much? Scholars are divided. Some claim the sacred marriage was symbolic, acted out through poetry and prayer rather than literal consummation. Others insist, based on temple records and hymns, that the physical act was very real, and that participants considered it an honour to offer themselves to the goddess through ritual union. One Sumerian hymn to Inanna declares, "He has taken his pleasure with me, he has stretched out on my sweet bed, he has made me holy with his embrace." If that's not a description of divine pleasure, it's hard to imagine what is. The room is thick with incense now. The priestess approaches, lays a hand gently on your chest, not demanding, not suggestive, just anchoring. And you understand this isn't about conquest or climax. This is about entering the current that runs under all the things. The flow of breath, of rhythm, of yes. There's no music beyond her voice, no candles beyond the low flame, and yet you feel lit from within, every inch of skin humming with something you can't name. This is not performance, this is presence. The priestess does not become Inanna. She doesn't have to. She already is. You leave the temple hours later, though time feels like a lie. The sky is dark now, stars scattered like offerings across the desert sky. The city sleeps, unaware that somewhere in its centre, a ritual as old as humanity still pulses. A reminder that before guilt, before shame, before the body was declared unworthy, there were temples that taught ecstasy as a way to know the gods, and sometimes the gods answer. The stars above the ziggurat fade slowly into a bruised dawn, and the desert wind wraps around your shoulders like a shawl of stories. You've danced, bathed, confessed, and watched gods rise in sweat and breath. You've walked through temples where touch was sacred and the body was scripture. But tonight, your journey takes you not to a place where the rituals are performed, but to the place where they're hidden, buried under centuries of rewritten history and locked behind gilded doors. Welcome to medieval Europe's cloisters and cathedrals, where the rituals of sacred pleasure didn't vanish. They just slipped into the shadows of illuminated manuscripts and the daydreams of mystics, and if you know how to look, you'll find them again, cloaked in metaphor, humming softly in Latin, waiting. You arrive at a monastery just before sunrise. It's silent, perfectly so, with rows of cypress trees casting long shadows across the gravel path. The air smells like beeswax, old parchment, and something else. Incense, maybe, or memory. A monk in dark robes passes without acknowledging you. Another tends to the herb garden in silence. They walk like men trying not to disturb a secret they themselves no longer understand. But beneath this carefully ordered stillness lies a trembling truth. The body never forgot what the church tried to erase. Inside the scriptorium, sunlight filters through stained glass, pooling in colours across the stone floor. You run your fingers along the edge of a wooden desk where a manuscript lies open. It's a book of hours, devotional readings for the laity, but in the margins, someone long ago has doodled a naked woman riding a fish, and just beyond that, a man with a conspicuously oversized nose pressed to the base of a tree. These aren't just idle scribbles. They're code, hidden expressions of a sacred truth that couldn't be spoken aloud. Your historical anchor tonight is this. By the 12th and 13th centuries, mystical Christianity began to flourish in Europe. Think Hildegard of Bingen, Meister Eckhart, Julian of Norwich, men and women who described union with God in startlingly sensual terms. Hildegard spoke of the fiery life of the divine, pulsing through all things. Julian described Christ enfolding her like a lover. And Eckhart? He dared to say that the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. The line between the divine and the body was not erased. It was blurred until it shimmered. Fringe. Fact. Some of Hildegard's visions involved liquid light entering her body, flowing through her like nectar. She described the experience as both overwhelming and intimate. One might say, ecstatic. But these weren't bedroom metaphors. They were the only language she had to describe complete surrender. What she believed was the soul's deepest prayer. You step into the chapel now, its ceiling arched like a ribcage, enclosing you in breath and stone. A nun is kneeling at the front alone, whispering something that's not quite a prayer, not quite a song. She rocks slightly, eyes closed, face flushed. You realize you've interrupted something private, something devotional, but felt. She doesn't look at you, she doesn't need to. Her communion isn't with the altar alone, or it's with the holy ache she's been taught to repress, and instead has learned to consecrate. This is where the debate burns hottest among scholars. Were these ecstatic experiences truly sensual, or simply metaphorical descriptions of divine union? Conservative theologians argue for abstraction, claiming that mystics merely use the language of passion to describe spiritual events. But others point out the overwhelming bodily detail, the tremors, the warmth, the weeping, the sheer intensity of these visions, and ask, what if they weren't metaphors? What if these mystics had stumbled onto the same path as the priestesses, the tantrikas, the temple dancers, but in a world that demanded they call it something else? You sit in a side chapel now, facing a statue of the Virgin Mary, though not the sanitized version you remember. This Mary is crowned, full-hipped, holding a ripe pomegranate and staring with heavy-lidded eyes that know more than they say. Around her are painted symbols, stars, lilies, and winding serpents. The snake, long considered the symbol of temptation, was once also a sign of wisdom, healing, and transformation. The forbidden became holy, again. You notice a carving in the wood near your seat. 2 hands, one open, one clenched, encircled by a ring of thorns and vines. It's not decorative, it's a map, a guide to something no longer taught from the pulpit. You realize these monasteries, these convents, weren't just places of repression, they were archives. Containment chambers for a sacred heat that refused to die. And now you begin to see it everywhere. In the illuminated manuscripts with marginalia too cheeky for piety. In the architecture, where rose windows spiral like vulvas of stained glass. In the music, where Gregorian chants rise and fall like breath. Even in the liturgy itself, with its language of feeding, consuming, longing and release. The body may have been labelled suspect, but it never left the page. It just changed costumes. You return to the scriptorium, heart full of images that won't fade. The man who drew the woman riding the fish may have never known Inanna's name, but his ink remembered her. The nun in the chapel may have never danced beneath a moonlit tree, but her breath kept time with ancient rhythms, and you begin to understand that every suppressed ritual, every erased goddess, every temple left in ruin didn't vanish. It just folded itself into dreams, prayers, and metaphors, waiting for someone someday to read between the lines. You step outside as the morning bells ring, scattering crows from the belfry. The world is awake now, the village bustling, the monks emerging for their daily rites. But you carry something deeper. a secret handed down through silent margins and trembling visions. Because even in the age of doctrine and denial, sacred pleasure found ways to whisper, "I'm still here, I never left." The morning light has softened now, turning golden as it passes through the mist that still clings to the trees. You've walked through centuries, breathed incense, tasted wine, watched bodies become temples and temples become memory. And still, the story isn't finished. Because this journey doesn't end in silence or ruin. It ends with a return, not just to ritual, but to remembrance. You've followed the sacred thread of pleasure through time, and now you arrive in a place that doesn't look like a temple at all. It's a quiet house in a forgotten village, a wooden door, a flickering oil lamp in the window, but inside is the echo of every ritual you've ever seen. Tonight, you enter the house of the remembered flame. It's unmarked, no sign, no symbol. But as you step across the threshold, you feel it, the warmth, the invitation, the gravity that says, "This place has been waiting for you." The room is circular, dim, lit only by candles nestled into alcoves along the walls. In the centre lies a stone hearth, where a low fire burns, not roaring but steady. Around it sit women and men, young and old, some draped in shawls, others bare-shouldered, all quiet. They look up as you enter, but not with surprise, just recognition. You're not the first to arrive at the end of the map. You won't be the last. A woman rises. She doesn't speak. She simply gestures for you to sit by the fire. Her eyes are lined with coal, her fingers stained with herbs. You wonder if she once stood in a temple in Ephesus, or danced in the shadow of a ziggurat, or walked the cliffs above a Tibetan monastery. It doesn't matter. All places lead here. You sit and you listen. The room hums, not with chanting, but with the weight of knowing. The woman begins to speak, not in prophecy, not in scripture, but in story. She tells of a time before time when gods were not distant, but inhabited flesh, and bodies were not judged, but honoured. When desire was not a weakness, but a doorway, and when each union, each breath was an act of creation. You don't need to ask which god she means, they are all here. Inanna, Hathor, Tlazolteotl, Xochipilli, the unnamed ones who watched over caves and hearths and mountain springs. The gods you've met, and the ones whose names were stolen but whose touch remains. She speaks of the erasure, the burning scrolls, the silenced rites, the rebranding of priestesses into harlots, of pleasure into sin. But she doesn't speak in anger, just with the clarity of someone who has outlived empires. They buried us, she says, but they didn't know we were seeds. Fringe fact. Instance, even in modern times, echoes of these sacred pleasures survive in folk traditions, midwifery chants, and even children's rhymes. In rural parts of Eastern Europe, women still gather at moonrise to sing songs to the river, a custom officially about harvest luck, but whose verses, when translated, speak of joining, longing, and ecstatic reunion. In South America, curandras still whisper prayers that once belonged to Pachamama's priestesses. In North Africa, certain belly dances trace movements that map directly onto ancient fertility rites. And the debate, it rages on as always. Are these survivals real or wishful reconstructions? Scholars argue endlessly. Some dismiss modern connections as romantic anachronism, fragments stitched into a tapestry that never truly existed. Others insist these rituals survived not because they were remembered with perfect fidelity, but because they were too powerful to forget completely. What survives in the body doesn't need footnotes, it needs breath. Back in the house, the fire flickers. Someone begins to hum, a low melodic tone that wraps around your ribs and makes your lungs ache. Another joins in, and then another. Soon the room is vibrating with sound, not music exactly, but frequency. The same one you felt in every temple, every cave, every whispered rite across this whole journey. A hand touches yours, gently, grounding. You look up and see a young man, eyes wide but them were steady. His skin is marked with symbols drawn in ash and honey. He nods once, not a question, but a welcome. You nod back. Together, you rise and step toward the hearth. There's no script now, no formal liturgy, just presence, touch, breath. You close your eyes and the fire warms your cheeks. You inhale, and the scent of myrrh from Egypt, frankincense from Arabia, sandalwood from India, and copal from Mesoamerica all swirl into one memory, one flame, one god. In that moment, the ritual isn't historical, it's happening. The circle around you hums louder, not frantic, not rising to climax, just deepening, like sinking into water until everything else fades. You feel your heart sink with the rhythm. You feel the electric tension between skin and spirit. And for one impossible instant, you are not a visitor, not a student, not a historian. You are a priest of the body. You are a keeper of sacred flame. The moment passes, not with finality, but with reverence. You open your eyes. The fire still burns. The room is still full. But now you carry something different. A man offers you a cup of something warm, spiced, sweet, and bitter all at once. You drink, and the warmth spreads through you like a second fire. He says simply, "You've seen the temple. Now you are the temple." And that is the truth that's weighted behind every mask, every veil, every lock. The rituals were never just about sex or gods or offering. They were about returning to wholeness, about remembering that the divine isn't just something we reach for, but something we embody. In lips, in hands, in eyes, in the shiver that runs down your spine when someone touches you like they see your soul. The people in this room begin to rise, stretching, smiling. No applause, no ceremony, just the completion of a cycle, like rain returning to the sea. You walk to the door, and before you leave, you turn back. The woman at the hearth gives you the smallest nod. Not goodbye, just go. You step outside into the night, and everything is quiet, but not empty. You carry the temples with you now, not as ruins, not as stories, but as inheritance, because sacred pleasure was never truly forbidden, just hidden. And now you know where to look. You've returned home now, whatever that means for you. Maybe it's a bed in a quiet apartment, maybe a worn couch where the TV hums low in the background, maybe just a safe place behind your own eyelids. The journey is over, and yet, not really. Because even as your body rests, even as the edges of memory start to blur and the flicker of ancient torches fades behind your eyes, something inside you is still moving, still warming, still pulsing with the rhythm of a truth too old to be forgotten and too alive to stay buried. All the temples you walk through, the sun-drenched sanctuaries, the underground hideaways, the moonlit courtyards of worship, laughter and release, they don't just belong to history. They belong to you now, because what they carried wasn't a doctrine. It wasn't about stone walls or gods with names written in fading ink. What they held was a message whispered in skin, in breath, in the way two hands can find each other in darkness and know they're not alone. That message, you're sacred, your longing is sacred, your pleasure is a doorway, not a detour. And yes, the world tried to silence that. It burned scrolls, it whitewashed statues, it called priestesses unclean and made shame the price of intimacy. But the rituals lived on anyway, in lullabies, in folk dances, in the flicker of candlelight when someone undresses not for display but for connection. Every time someone says, "This feels holy," without needing to explain why, the flame is still burning. So as you lie there now, eyes heavy, maybe your body aching in the good way, let it sink in. Sacred pleasure didn't die, it just learned to whisper. You've heard it again tonight, and maybe tomorrow you'll feel it, in a lover's kiss, in a song that makes your skin prickle, in the silence that feels like being held. That's the temple calling, and you know how to enter.